Right, so tonight we're going somewhere pretty. That's the whole idea, really. Out of every place Pokémon has ever sent us over the years, Kalos is the one that was built, from start to finish, around simply being lovely to look at. And I've always had a soft spot for it because of that. If you've never spent much time there, Kalos is the region from Pokémon X and Y, the 6th generation of the games. And it's the one shaped like France, properly shaped like it, star points and all. The team who made it took the word beauty and just ran at it for a couple of years, which is a slightly mad thing to build an entire video game around when you stop and think about it. But they did, and it mostly worked. The name gives the game away, if you know where to look. Kalos comes from an old Greek word, kalos, which just means beauty, and the whole generation leaned into that idea without much shame at all. Beauty and bonds, and this quiet thread running underneath about how things change and grow. That's the mood we're settling into for the next few hours. I'm not going to rush any of this. We've got the time, and there's no test at the end. So if you drift off somewhere around the middle, that's sort of the point. We'll wander through the city that's secretly Paris. We'll meet a very tall, very old king who's rather sad about a flower. We'll talk about a deer and a bird shaped like the letters X and Y, because someone genuinely decided that was a good idea. And to be fair to them, they were right. And somewhere along the way, I'll tell you about a butterfly whose wings change pattern, depending on which country you happen to be sitting in right now. If you like this kind of thing, sleepy little deep dives into worlds you already half remember, there's a subscribe button knocking about somewhere. No pressure at all. It'll still be there in the morning. For now, let's just start walking. West, I reckon, out towards the quiet edge of the map, where France gently begins. The first thing worth sitting with is the shape of the place, because it tells you almost everything about what the developers were going for. Kalos is modelled on the northern half of France, not vaguely inspired by it, not France-ish. The actual northern chunk of the country, traced out and turned into a map you can walk around. It even has that faint star shape to it, which is a nice touch, and the towns and cities line up roughly where their real French counterparts would sit. If you've ever glanced at a map of France and then squinted at a map of Kalos, the resemblance is honestly a bit uncanny. And this wasn't a happy accident. Back in 2011, the game's director, Junichi Masuda, actually flew out to France with some of the team to soak the place up and gather material. They wandered around, took things in, and came home with a region in their heads. What I like about that is how deliberate it all was. They'd already settled on the theme before they picked the country. The theme was beauty, and then they went looking for the most fitting place on Earth to hang that idea on. France, with its whole reputation for fashion and food, and being one of the most visited countries going, more or less put its hand up and volunteered. Once you know that, you start noticing the themes everywhere, in a good way. Take the town names. Nearly every settlement in Kalos is named after a plant, or an ingredient used in perfume, which fits a region this obsessed with beauty right down to the ground. Vanilleville comes from vanilla. Santa Luna has sandalwood tucked away inside it. Camphria is camphor. Coumarine borrows a fragrant compound called coumarin. And Anistar has aniseed hiding in the middle of the word. So the whole map is quietly scented in a sense. Every town named after something you might find in a bottle of perfume or on a spice rack. I didn't notice it at all the first time through, and then someone pointed it out and I couldn't unsee it. Here's a fun detail that always makes me grin though. For all the effort to make Kalos feel French, the game can't quite help itself. Wander around long enough and you'll bump into an NPC who, out of nowhere, starts speaking German. Just a line about Pokémon being in their Pokeballs, and him sitting on a chair. Completely random. And plenty of other characters will drop little French phrases mid-sentence. A très bien here, a bonjour there, the sort of thing a tourist picks up in a weekend. So it's not really a pure France, it's more like Europe as seen through a slightly starry-eyed holiday lens, which, if I'm honest, feels about right for a region obsessed with being beautiful. I think that's what keeps pulling me back to Kalos, actually. A lot of Pokémon regions are based on real places. That's nothing new, but most of them are based on parts of Japan, and unless you know Japan well, the references sail quietly over your head. Kalos wears its inspiration right out in the open. You don't need a guidebook to feel it. You look at the tower in the middle of the big city, and your brain just goes, "Oh, that's the Eiffel Tower, isn't it?" And it is. We'll get to that one properly in a bit. For now, picture the map. That star-shaped stretch of northern France, laid out in soft colours, dotted with castles and cafes and standing stones, waiting to be wandered through. There are worse places to spend a few sleepy hours, if you ask me. Now, since we've mentioned that tower in the middle of everything, let's talk a little about the city it belongs to. Stand in the middle of Lumiose City and look up, and there's really no pretending anymore. That's Paris. They're not even being coy about it. Lumiose is the big central city of Kalos, the beating heart of the whole map, and it is explicitly, openly based on Paris. Even the name is a bit of a wink. Lumiose leans on the French word lumière, meaning light, which of course is exactly what Paris has been nicknamed for donkey's years. The City of Light. So before you've done anything at all, the name is already telling you where you are. The tower in the centre, Prism Tower, is based on the Eiffel Tower. That's the one your brain recognises instantly. The tall, lit-up spire you can see from half the city. In the game, it doubles as the gym, which is a rather clever bit of design when you think about it, sticking the most important building in the region right in the spot where France's most famous landmark stands. And it worked so well that Prism Tower even turned up as a stage in the Super Smash Bros. Games, which is a nice little afterlife for a fictional Eiffel Tower. But the Paris references go a good deal deeper than just the tower. And this is where it gets properly satisfying. The city is laid out in this circular, radial pattern, with everything spiralling out from a central plaza. That's lifted straight from a real Paris landmark, the Place Charles de Gaulle, the big roundabout where the Arc de Triomphe sits, with all those avenues fanning out from it like spokes on a wheel. Lumiose does the same thing, just with the tower in the middle instead of the arch. There's even a canal, the Saison Canal, cutting diagonally through the city, and that's almost certainly standing in for the River Seine. Now here's the detail I genuinely love, the one that shows how much care went into this. When the developers mapped real Paris landmarks onto Lumiose, they flipped a lot of them vertically. So places that sit north of the Seine in the real city ended up placed south of the canal in the game, and vice versa. It's this quiet little mirror trick. Most players will never notice it in 100 years, and yet somebody sat there and worked out the geography carefully enough to invert it on purpose. That's the kind of thing that makes me smile. Nobody asked them to do that. They just did. And like the real Paris, Lumiose is absolutely stuffed with cafes and shops and restaurants, because France and its capital have this reputation for food and glamour and having somewhere lovely to sit on every corner. The game runs with it. There's a whole thing where you can walk into one of the city's restaurants, pay for a meal, and then get politely ambushed. Each course comes with a battle against the server before they'll bring out the next one. And they're not normal battles either. Depending on which restaurant you pick, you're thrown into double battles, triple battles, or these slightly dizzying rotation battles where your Pokémon spin in and out. So you sit down expecting dinner and end up in a 3-course brawl. Very Kalos that. Even the fighting is meant to feel a bit fancy. Lumiose is also just enormous by Pokémon standards. For a long time it stood as one of the largest and most populated cities in the entire Pokémon world, second only to one other place that came along years later in a different region. When you're actually wandering it, that scale really lands. There are gates leading out to 5 different routes, wide boulevards on the outer ring, narrower Parisian-style streets tucked inside, and cars and go-goats sharing the roads, which is a sentence I enjoy getting to say. It genuinely feels like a city you could get a bit lost in, which no Pokémon town had really managed before. There's a slightly funny wrinkle to all this grandeur, mind you. When you first arrive, most of the city is shut off to you because of a blackout. You're stuck pottering around a couple of streets while the lights are down, and you only get the run of the place properly once you've sorted out some business elsewhere and someone gets the power back on. So your first impression of the great shining city of light is, ironically, a city with most of its lights off. I always found that quite funny, in a low-key way. Paris, but the fuse has gone. Still, once it's lit, it's the showpiece of the region, and rightly so. If Kalos was built to be beautiful, Lumios is where they spent most of the budget, and we've only just scratched it, because the rest of the map is hiding just as much real France as the city is. Speaking of which, let's take a slow drive out of the city and see what else they smuggled in from the real world. Let's not hurry this bit. One of the nicest things you can do in Kalos is just amble from town to town and quietly play Spot the Real Place, because almost every stop on the map is nodding at something genuine in France. It's a bit like flipping through a holiday scrapbook, where every photo has a Pokémon photo bombing it. Start with Parfum Palace, because it's the showiest. It's this grand, sprawling estate down a lovely riverside path, all manicured gardens and gold trim, and it's very obviously the Palace of Versailles. And the developers had a proper sense of humour about it. Versailles, in real life, is famously eye-wateringly expensive to keep running. All that gilt and all those fountains. So in the game, they gave the palace a preposterous entrance fee. You turn up, you want to look inside, and it costs you a small fortune, which is exactly the joke, because the upkeep on a place like that is ruinous. I love it when a game buries a bit of real history inside a gag you might not even get. Then there's Geosenge Town, which is this quiet little place built around a cluster of standing stones. Now, a lot of people take one look at standing stones and immediately think Stonehenge. Understandable, but Stonehenge is in England and Kalos is France, so that never quite added up. The real inspiration is the Karnak stones over in Brittany, these enormous rows of Neolithic menhirs stretching across the landscape. And here's the lovely part. Masuda specifically added that whole area to the game after visiting Karnak in person and being taken with it. So it's not a generic bit of ancient mystery, it's a particular field of stones that genuinely moved someone enough to put it in the game. The town's motto, funnily enough, is that quiet stones speak volumes, which is a bit ominous once you learn what's buried underneath them. But that's a story for later. Keep driving and you hit Snowbell City, right up in the cold corner of the map, where it never seems to stop snowing. That's based on Besançon, a real French city tucked near the Jura Mountains, which gets so bitter in winter that people sometimes call the area Little Siberia. Besançon also happens to be the historic capital of French watchmaking, a city obsessed with tiny, precise machinery, which I think is a rather poetic thing to have inspired the snowy town right before the final gym. There's something nice about the coldest, most remote spot on the map being modelled on a place famous for patience and precision. Campria town gives us Chabonneau Castle, which is a nod to the Château de Blois, an old noble residence steeped in French history. In the game, the castle's backstory is that it was once home to a noble family who habitually gave away all their possessions, which lines up neatly with the real chateau's reputation for royal extravagance. There's something quietly sad and lovely about that, a grand old house slowly emptied out by sheer generosity, left standing as a faded memory of the people who used to fill it. Down on the coast there's Ambiment town, a little seaside spot based on La Rochelle, which in real life is the only deep water port on France's Atlantic coast. And scattered around you'll find caves that pull from real French sites too. The Glittering Cave draws on caves known for their preserved prehistoric paintings. And there's Reflection Cave, this gorgeous place, full of mirrored surfaces, which is based on La Roche-au-Fay, a real megalithic monument whose name literally translates to the Fairies' Rock, said in local legend to have been raised by fairies, which for a region that introduced the fairy type is a rather perfect place to sneak in. And then, right at the end of the whole journey, the Pokémon League itself. When you finally reach the region's ultimate challenge, the building you walk into is an homage to Notre Dame, the great Gothic cathedral in Paris. All those soaring spires, the sense of grandeur, even the big rose windows. It's a proper cathedral of a finale, which is a lovely note to end the region's architecture on. You spend the whole adventure wandering through this loving recreation of France, and the last door you walk through is its most famous church. There's a slightly bittersweet footnote to that one, mind. The real Notre Dame caught fire in 2019, years after these games came out, and spent a long time being carefully rebuilt. So the game now holds this little frozen snapshot of the cathedral from before all that, which I don't think anyone planned, but it's quietly touching all the same. What gets me about this whole tour is the sheer patience of it. None of these references are needed to make the game work. You could have played the entire thing, beaten the league, and never once realised that half the towns were quiet love letters to real French places. But the team put them in anyway, layer after layer, just for the handful of people who'd go looking. That generosity is very much the spirit of Kalos. Right, we've done the scenery. Let's talk about who you actually bring along for the trip, because it starts with the choice of 3. Every Pokémon adventure starts the same way, really. Somebody hands you a small creature and says, right, off you go, good luck. In Kalos, that moment happens in Aquacord Town, a quiet little riverside spot, and your 3 options are Chespin, Fennekin, and Froakie. Grass, fire, water, same as it ever was. But there's a lovely bit of hidden design in this particular trio that I think is worth a proper sit-down. There's a long-running fan theory, and it's a good one, that the 3 Kalos starters are secretly built around classic role-playing game character classes, the sort of thing you'd pick at the start of an old fantasy game. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Chespin, the little spiny chestnut fellow, is the knight. The armoured one, the tank, the brave sort who charges in and takes the hits. Fennekin, the elegant firefox, is the mage. The spellcaster, all robes and staffs and clever tricks. And Froakie, the frog, is the ninja or the rogue. The quick, sneaky one who slips in and out of the shadows. Knight, mage, and thief. It's the exact party you'd assemble in a fantasy RPG, just shrunk down into 3 adorable creatures. And the game absolutely leans into it once they evolve. Gehispin's final form, Chesnaught, gains the fighting type and turns into this hulking, shell-armoured bruiser who genuinely looks like a knight in plate. Fennekin becomes Delphox, which picks up the psychic type and ends up looking for all the world like a witch or a wizard, right down to holding a little wand-like stick it pulls from its own tail to cast fire. And Froakie becomes Greninja, which gains the dark type and is, unmistakably, a ninja frog. Tongue wrapped around its neck like a scarf, throwing stars made of compressed water. The fantasy classes aren't just in the babies. They see the whole thing through to the end. No notes, honestly. It's a genuinely tidy piece of design. The real animals behind them are fun too. Fennekin is a fennec fox, that tiny desert fox with the enormous ears, which is why it vents heat out of its ears in the games. Chespin has a bit of hedgehog and a bit of chestnut going on, spiky shell and all. And Froakie is a frog, plain and simple, but a frog covered in these little bubbles of foam it secretes from its chest and back. 3 real creatures, 3 fantasy jobs stitched together. That's the sort of double layering Kalos does quietly all over the place. Now, of the 3, 1 became an absolute phenomenon, and it's not really a contest. Greninja blew up. It became so wildly popular that it went on to appear as a playable fighter in Super Smash Bros., rubbing shoulders with the likes of Pikachu and Charizard, which is no small thing for a creature that started life as one of 3 options in a 2013 game. There's even a special version of it in the anime, this heightened Bond form, that got fans talking for ages. Poor old Chesnaught and Delphox are both lovely, and I'll defend both of them. but they were always going to be standing a bit in Greninja's shadow. Such is life when you're the cool ninja frog. Here's the bonus fact I really like though, and it's the sort of thing that made Kalos feel generous. Not long after you get your Kalos starter, you go and visit Professor Sycamore, the region's rather charming professor, and he just hands you a second starter, a Kanto one. Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle, your pick, straight out of the very first games. So early on, you end up raising 2 starters side by side, one from Kalos and one from the classics. And it gets better, because those Kanto starters come with the ability to mega evolve later on, which was a proper treat for anyone who'd grown up with the originals. It's a small thing, but it says a lot about the mood of these games. Here's a creature to start your journey. Oh, and here's a bit of nostalgia to go with it. On the house. I always thought that was a warm way to open an adventure. Most games make you choose one and live with it. Kalos lets you have a foot in the present and a foot in the past, right from the first hour. For a generation so obsessed with beauty and bonds, giving you 2 partners instead of 1 feels exactly on brand. There's one more thing worth mentioning before we move on, which is that your choice quietly ripples outward. The friend who travels with you, Shauna, ends up picking the starter that's weak to yours, and later on, the rival picks the one that beats yours. So the little type triangle gets neatly completed by the people around you without anyone making a fuss about it. It's a small, tidy bit of world building that most people never clock. The 3 creatures always find their way into 3 sets of hands. Anyway, you've got your knight, or your mage, or your thief. Now let's talk about something that shook up the entire game the moment it arrived, and quietly rewrote a load of Pokémon you thought you already knew. Here's a thing that sounds small, but genuinely reshaped the entire game underneath the surface. Kalos introduced a brand new type, the Fairy type, and it was the first time they'd added a new type since way back in the Gold and Silver days, right at the end of the 90s. So this wasn't a casual little addition. This was the first new kind of Pokémon in well over a decade. Now on the surface, Fairy is exactly what it sounds like. Pink, sparkly, cute, a bit whimsical. Things like Sylveon and Spritzy and the little flower Pokémon Flabébé. All very charming, very in keeping with a region built around beauty. But if you peek behind the curtain, the real reason Fairy exists is far more practical, and honestly, a bit funny. It was added to fix a problem. Specifically, to sort out the dragon type. Let me explain, because this is the sort of thing I find weirdly satisfying. For years, dragon-type Pokémon had been a bit of a nightmare to deal with competitively. They were powerful, and they had almost no weaknesses. Basically, the only things that reliably beat a dragon were ice attacks and other dragons, which meant the best way to counter a scary dragon was to bring your own scary dragon. Not exactly balanced. So the developers introduced Fairy partly as a hard counter. Fairy types resist dragon, and dragon can't touch them at all with its own attacks. Suddenly all those unstoppable dragons had a natural predator, and it was a bunch of pink cherubs. I think that's brilliant. The scariest creatures in the game, brought low by fairies. There's a fairy tale logic to it that I can't help enjoying. But the really interesting bit, the thing that quietly rippled through the whole series, is what happened to older Pokémon. Because they didn't just make new fairy types, they went back and reclassified a load of existing ones. Overnight, creatures you thought you knew inside out simply became fairy. Clefairy, obviously, given the name. Jigglypuff, the little singing balloon. Marill, the round blue mouse. Togepi, the egg. Mr. Mime, even Gardevoir, who'd been around for years, suddenly picked up a fairy typing. It was this strange, gentle retcon where a chunk of the existing Pokédex quietly changed identity. If you'd been raising a Clefable for years, it woke up one generation a slightly different creature. I remember that taking a moment to get used to, that feeling of the ground shifting under Pokémon you'd known forever. The poster child for the new type, though, is Sylveon. Sylveon is an evolution of Eevee, that little fox with the ridiculous number of possible evolutions, and it was the first new one they'd added in a good while. It's this soft, pale, ribbon-trailing thing, and it's genuinely lovely. But what makes Sylveon special isn't just that it's the flagship fairy, it's how you get one. Because Sylveon doesn't evolve from a stone or a level or any of the usual methods. It evolves through affection. This is where the game's whole bonds theme starts poking through into the mechanics, and I love that it does. To get a Sylveon, you have to actually build a relationship with your Eevee. You play with it, feed it, fuss over it, until it likes you enough. And then, with a fairy move in its back pocket, it transforms. Your Eevee becomes a Sylveon essentially because it loves you, which is a genuinely sweet idea for a creature to evolve. And it was one of the first times the games really tied evolution to emotion rather than just numbers. We'll come back to that whole affection system properly later, because it does more than you'd think. But it starts here, with a fox that changes shape out of fondness. What I appreciate about the fairy type, looking back, is how neatly it does two jobs at once, which is very Kalos. On the pretty surface, it's the type that fits a beautiful, fashion-obsessed region perfectly, all ribbons and sparkles and charm. And underneath, it's a cold, calculated bit of game design, quietly rebalancing years of lopsided type matchups, and finally giving those unbeatable dragons something to fear. Beauty on top, careful machinery underneath. That's more or less the whole generation in a single type if you think about it. There's a slightly cheeky footnote too. Because Fairy also happens to be strong against dark and fighting types, it didn't just humble the dragons. It quietly took some of the wind out of a lot of the edgy, tough guy Pokémon as well. All those brooding dark types that had spent generations feeling untouchable suddenly had to worry about being beaten up by something that looked like it belonged on a greetings card. I find that endlessly funny. The toughest, moodiest creatures in the game, undone by fairies and ribbons. Kalos really did decide that beauty would win, and then went and wrote it into the rules. Right, that's one of the two huge shake-ups this generation brought in. The other one is even flashier, and it happens right in the middle of battle. Let's talk about Mega Evolution. So picture a battle. Two Pokémon facing off, nothing unusual. And then one of them starts to glow and shift and grow, and a second later, it's a bigger, meaner, more elaborate version of itself. That's Mega Evolution, and it was the headline act of these games. It's the thing most people remember first when you say Pokémon X and Y. Let me walk through how it actually works, gently, because the setup is half the charm. Mega Evolution isn't a normal evolution. A normal evolution is permanent. Your Charmander becomes a Charmeleon and stays that way forever. Mega Evolution is different. It's temporary, it only happens in the middle of a battle, and the moment that battle ends, the Pokémon snaps right back to normal, as if nothing happened. So it's really more of a transformation than an evolution. A brief burst of extra power you can pull out when you need it, rather than a lasting change. I've always thought of it a bit like a superhero ripping their shirt open. Same person underneath, just briefly turned up to 11. To make it happen, you need a few pieces to line up, and this is where it gets nicely fiddly. First, the Pokémon itself has to be holding a special item called a Mega Stone, and each stone is unique to one particular species. A Charizardite for Charizard, a Lucarionite for Lucario, and so on. You can't just slap any old stone on any old creature. Second, you, the trainer, need to be carrying a keystone, set into a thing called the Mega Ring. And when both of those are present, and the bond between you is right, you get a little button in battle that lets you trigger the whole thing. The Pokémon Mega evolves and attacks in the same turn. It's a proper bit of theatre, and crucially, you only get one per battle. You can have a whole team of Pokémon capable of Mega evolving, but you have to choose. Only one of them gets to transform in any given fight, which turns it into this lovely, little strategic decision. When do I pull the trigger? Which one do I bring out? Do I save it or spend it now? There's a real weight to that choice, and it made battles feel a touch more dramatic than they had before. At launch, there were 28 of these mega evolutions to discover, which was a generous number for a brand new mechanic. And they weren't just palette swaps. A mega evolution changes a Pokemon's stats, usually quite dramatically, often changes its ability, and sometimes even changes its type entirely. So a mega form isn't just a stronger version, it can be a genuinely different creature with a different role to play. We'll get to some of the standout ones in a moment, because a couple of them cause proper arguments among fans. There's a nice bit of texture to how you collect the stones too. Some mega stones are simply handed to you as part of the story, but a lot of the best ones can only be found in the wild during a very specific window, in the post-game, between 8 and 9 in the evening, after the professor has upgraded your ring. So there was this whole ritual of setting your console clock to the right hour and going out stone hunting in the dark. I have a real fondness for that. There's something quietly lovely about a game asking you to go looking for treasure, only at a particular time of night, like the stones only wake up after dark. Now the reason Mega Evolution fits so snugly into Kalos, rather than feeling bolted on, comes back to the generation's obsession with bonds. Mega Evolution in the story is meant to be powered by the connection between a trainer and their Pokémon. It's not just about the right items, it's about the relationship. A Pokémon that trusts you, that's close to you, can reach further than one that doesn't, which is exactly the same emotional thread running through the fairy type and that whole affection business we touched on. The games keep quietly insisting that closeness makes things stronger. It's a soft idea to build a battle mechanic around, and I think that's rather sweet. There's also a genuine mystery stitched into the lore of it, which I'll only tease here because it deserves its own moment later. The origins of Mega Evolution are treated as this ancient, half-understood thing that people in the world are still researching. There are stones involved, and old legends, and a certain very tall, very old man whose story reaches back thousands of years and connects to all of it. But we'll get to him. For now, just know that Mega Evolution isn't presented as a modern gimmick. In the world of Kalos, it's an old and slightly sacred force that people are only just beginning to understand again. What I'll say, standing back from it, is that Mega Evolution was a proper spectacle, and it arrived at exactly the right time. The whole generation had just moved into 3D. Everything looked shinier and more dramatic than ever. And here was this mechanic built entirely around a big cinematic transformation in the heat of battle. It suited the moment perfectly. Kalos wanted to be beautiful and a bit theatrical, and Mega Evolution is beauty and theatre welded together. Speaking of which, let's talk about the specific Megas that got everyone worked up, because a couple of Pokémon were shown outrageous favouritism. Not every Pokémon got a Mega form, and the ones that did tell you a lot about who the developers and the fans actually loved. Because a couple of creatures got showered with attention in a way that's honestly a bit unfair on everyone else. Charizard being the obvious culprit. Charizard got 2 Mega Evolutions. 2, most Pokémon that got one at all were thrilled to have it, and Charizard swans in with a pair. There's Mega Charizard X, which turns it black and blue, and wonderfully, finally makes it part dragon, which is the type everyone always assumed Charizard was anyway, despite it never actually being one. And there's Mega Charizard Y, which keeps it more classic, orange and winged, and leans into being a fearsome flying beast. And of course this immediately started a war. X or Y, which is the better Charizard. People have strong, deeply held, faintly ridiculous opinions about this, and I include myself in that. For what it's worth, I lean X, purely because giving Charizard the dragon type after all those years felt like the game admitting what we'd all known since we were kids, but I won't die on that hill. Much. And it's not just Charizard who got the double treatment. Mewtwo, the legendary psychic terror from the very first games, also got 2 mega forms, one tied to each version of the game. There's a version you're more likely to run into depending on whether you're playing X or Y, which is a neat little way of making the 2 games feel distinct. So the 2 most iconic, most beloved fire and psychic Pokémon in the whole franchise each got a matching pair of megas, 1 per game. The favoritism could not be clearer, and honestly, I can't even be cross about it, because they're both gorgeous. The one the game actually uses to teach you Mega Evolution, though, is Lucario. Early on, you meet a gym leader called Karina, a roller skating, Lucario-loving whirlwind of a character, and she's the one who hands you the whole Mega business and helps you get to grips with it. So Lucario becomes the face of the mechanic for a lot of players. It's the first Pokémon most people ever see Mega evolve, and Karina and her Lucario are proper fan favourites because of it. There's a warmth to that whole introduction. She's so delighted about Mega Evolution that it's a bit infectious. There was also an early gift that a lot of people took advantage of. Right near the start, players could pick up a special Torchic that came holding the stone it needed to Mega evolve into Mega Blaziken later on. Free of charge, just for logging in during a certain window. And Mega Blaziken is a monster, so plenty of first playthroughs quietly leaned on that little fire chicken far more than the game probably intended. I definitely did. No shame in it. Then there's the one that broke everything, and I say that with love. Mega Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan, that kangaroo with the baby in its pouch, got a mega form with an ability called Parental Bond, which let it essentially attack twice in a single move, the parent hitting and then the baby following up. On paper it sounds cute. In practice it was so absurdly effective in competitive play that it became one of the most notorious, most complained about, most swiftly restricted creatures of the entire era. A mum and her baby quietly terrorising tournaments. There's something very funny about the fact that out of all the fearsome dragons and legendaries, the thing that broke the competitive scene was a kangaroo doing school runs. I love that for it. Plenty of other classics got their moment too. Gengar, the mischievous ghost, got a lovely sinister Mega. Gyarados, the great sea serpent, got one that added the dark type and made it look even angrier than usual, which I didn't think was possible. Even Gardevoir, the elegant psychic fairy, got a Mega that suited it beautifully and turned up in the hands of the region's champion, though we'll get to her shortly. The pattern mostly was that the Pokémon people already adored got the glow up. Mega Evolution was in a way a big affectionate nod to the fans, handing extra power and extra style to the creatures that had earned their place in people's hearts over the years. There's a slightly wistful note to all this from where we're sitting now. Mind, for a long time, Mega Evolution felt like a Kalos thing, a one-generation treat. It stuck around for a little while, then quietly vanished from the games for years, which made a lot of people sad, because it was such a beloved feature. It had this reputation as the great lost mechanic, the flashy trick everyone wanted back, but that's a thread for the very end of tonight, so I'll leave it dangling for now. What I keep coming back to is how much personality Mega Evolution gave the roster. It didn't add many new Pokémon, but it made the ones we already had feel fresh and exciting again. That's a clever trick. Rather than filling the world with strangers, Kalos took your old friends and let them briefly become the most dramatic versions of themselves. Very in keeping with a generation that cared more about beauty and bonds than sheer numbers. Right? We've been dancing around the 2 big legendary Pokémon of these games long enough. Let's give them their due, starting with the one on the box of Pokémon X. A deer. A very strange, very lovely deer. Look at Xerneas and the first thing that hits you is the colours. It's this tall, elegant, deep blue stag with a great crown of antlers that shimmer in every colour of the rainbow, like someone strung fairy lights through a forest. It's on the cover of Pokémon X, and it is, I think, one of the genuinely beautiful legendary designs. Rainbow Crystal Deer. Ridiculous, and I mean that as the highest compliment. Xerneas is the Pokémon of life. That's its whole deal. Everything about it points at growth and renewal and living things. It's a fairy type, fittingly, given the region, and there's this gorgeous bit of lore attached to it. When Xerneas comes to the end of its life, it doesn't just die. It releases all its energy, turns into a tree, and gives that life back to everything around it, before settling into a long 1,000-year sleep. So death for Xerneas is really just life going somewhere else. I find that a properly lovely idea for a creature to embody. It's a legendary that's basically about the forest coming back every spring, forever. Now, if you look at it side on with its legs spread, Xerneas forms the shape of the letter X, which is not an accident, obviously, given the game it's on. The developers deliberately used the letters X and Y as the starting framework for these two legendaries, and then built creatures around those shapes. So the deer is an X, its antlers and legs splaying out into those diagonal points. It's the sort of thing you can't unsee once someone tells you. Here's the bit of design trivia I really enjoy though. Normally the legendary Pokémon are designed by a team of artists at Game Freak, including Ken Sugimori, the longtime art director who's been drawing these things since the very beginning. But Xerneas and Yveltal were apparently such a headache to get right that he had to bring in another designer, Atsuko Nishida, to help push them over the line. And between them, it still took around 18 months to finalise the pair. That's roughly 3 times as long as one of these designs usually takes. 18 months on 2 creatures. When you look at how intricate they both are, all those precise shapes and that careful symbolism, you can sort of see where the time went. But still, 1.5 years of drawing a deer and a bird, that's dedication. The deeper mythology behind Xerneas is where it gets really interesting, and this is the one big explanation I'll give for the whole legendary trio, because they're all tangled together. Xerneas, Yveltal, and the third one, Sigurd, are all widely thought to be built around Yggdrasil, the world tree from Norse mythology. In the old myths, Yggdrasil is this colossal tree that holds the whole cosmos together, and it's watched over by different creatures. There's a deer that grazes among its branches, there's an eagle up at the top, and there's a serpent down among its roots. And that's exactly the trio. Xerneas is the deer, up in the living branches. Yveltal is the bird. Sigurd is the serpent underground. 3 guardians of one great tree, split into 3 Pokémon. There's a neat little colour thing layered on top too, that I can't help pointing out. Xerneas is blue. Yveltal is red. Sigurd is green and black. Blue, red, green. Which happens to be the exact set of colours your screen uses to make every other colour. The old RGB model. Whether that's fully intentional or just a happy pattern, I genuinely can't tell you. But once you notice it, it's hard to believe it's a coincidence. A trio of world guardians, quietly colour-coded like the inside of a television. What I love most about Xerneas is how gentle its whole concept is, for something so grand. A lot of legendary Pokémon are about power or destruction or controlling time and space. Xerneas is about life simply continuing. It gives, it rests, it comes back. There's no menace to it at all. It's the kind of legendary you'd want watching over a forest. And it makes a lovely, calm counterweight to the thing on the other box, which is very much not gentle. Because for every idea about life, Kalos wanted a matching idea about death. And that brings us naturally to the bird. If Xerneas is the sunrise, Yveltal is the dusk. That's genuinely the best way I can put it. Where the deer is all soft blues and rainbow light and gentle renewal, Yveltal is this vast, blood-red bird with black markings running across it like veins, and its whole purpose is the exact opposite. Yveltal is the Pokémon of death. It's the mascot of Pokémon Y. It's a dark and flying type, and its story is the grim mirror of Xerneas Lovely One. Where the deer gives its life away and comes back, Yveltal takes life. When it reaches the end of its cycle, it spreads those enormous wings and absorbs the life force of everything around it, draining the world, and then it wraps itself into a cocoon and sleeps. So it's this creature that ends things in order to eventually renew itself, a sort of terrible reset button with wings. Beautiful and awful in equal measure, which is precisely the point. Held out with its wings and tail spread, Yveltal forms the letter Y, the same way Xerneas forms an X. Same trick, opposite creature. And the red running through it, all those vein-like lines across its body, is meant to make it feel almost like a living wound. It's a genuinely unsettling design when you sit with it, in a way that a kids' game legendary maybe has no right to be. I always found it a bit striking that a Pokémon game went quite this hard on the imagery of death. But Kalos wanted its beauty to have a dark half, and Yveltal is that dark half made flesh. Here's a small design debate I find genuinely fun though. Everyone calls Yveltal a bird and reaches for the word eagle. But look closely, and it's got this thick ruff of feathers around its neck. And those aren't really eagle feathers. They read much more like a vulture. And honestly, a vulture makes far more sense for a creature of death, doesn't it? Vultures are the birds that turn up at the end, that live off things that have already passed. An eagle is a bird of hunting and glory. A vulture is a bird of endings. So while the game never spells it out, I'm firmly in the vulture camp on this one. It fits the theme far too neatly to be an accident. On the mythology side, Yveltal slots straight into that world tree trio we talked about. It's the bird up at the top of the great tree, the one associated with death in the Old Norse framework, looking down over everything. I won't rehash the whole tree since we've been through it, but Yveltal is the sky half of that arrangement, the eye in the branches. Between the deer on the ground and the serpent in the roots, the bird has the run of the air, a tidy division of a whole cosmos into three creatures. What strikes me about Xerneas and Yveltal together is how cleanly they split a single idea in two: life and death, given and taken, blue and red, sunrise and dusk. They're the same base creature in a sense, built to the same scale, sharing the same underlying strength, just pointed in opposite directions. You could put them side by side and read the entire philosophy of the generation off them without a word of text. That's elegant design. Kalos was obsessed with beauty, and it decided quite boldly that beauty had to include death as well as life, which is a more grown-up idea than you'd expect from a game where you also skate around a city fighting waiters. And then, of course, there's a third one. Because two ideas as big as life and death need something to hold the balance between them. That's where the strangest member of the trio comes in, the one they clearly weren't quite ready to fully use yet. Every legendary trio in Pokémon tends to have a third member, the odd one out, the one that turns up to referee the other two. In Kalos, that's Zygarde, and it has one of the stranger, more drawn-out stories in the whole series, mostly because the developers clearly had big plans for it, and then didn't quite deliver them in these particular games. Zygarde is green, it's serpentine, and it's the guardian of order and balance. Its job in the lore is to keep an eye on the ecosystem of Kalos. When things fall out of balance, when the natural order gets threatened, Zygarde stirs and steps in to put things right. And crucially, it's specifically meant to watch over Xerneas and Yveltal, that whole life and death pairing we just talked about. If either of them tips too far, Zygarde is the one that's supposed to intervene. So if the deer is life and the bird is death, Zygarde is the thing standing between them, making sure neither gets out of hand. And it completes a rather satisfying bit of maths, this. Xerneas is your X, Yveltal is your Y, and Zygarde naturally is Z. But it goes a bit deeper than just the letters, Think about coordinates for a second. The x-axis runs side to side, flat along the ground, which fits Xerneas, a land creature. The y-axis runs up and down, into the air, which fits Yveltal, a flyer. And the z-axis, in 3 dimensions, is depth, which fits Sigarda, a creature that lives underground. So the trio isn't just X, Y, Z as letters. It's the 3 dimensions of space itself, 1 legendary for each direction. I think that's a genuinely clever bit of design, and it's the sort of thing that rewards you for thinking about it a bit too hard, which I always appreciate. Sigard is also unusual in its actual makeup, and this is where it gets a bit science fiction. It isn't really one solid creature. It's made up of loads of tiny individual cells and cores, little green bits scattered around, that come together to form its body. And depending on how many of those pieces gather, Sigard can take different forms. There's a smaller form when only some of them assemble, the standard serpent form when about half of them come together, and a towering complete form when all of them unite, which is said to be powerful enough to overwhelm even Xerneas or Yveltal. So it's this being that's genuinely more than the sum of its parts, a whole ecosystem of little components adding up to a guardian, which is a rather poetic thing for the Pokémon of balance to be. It's balance made literal, lots of small things holding together into one. Here's the honest catch though, and it's a bit of a shame. In Pokémon X and Y themselves, you never got to see any of that. All you could actually get was the middle form, the serpent, tucked away in a quiet cave in the postgame, presented without much fanfare at all. All the good stuff, the cells, the smaller dog-like form, the enormous complete form, none of it was really in these games. It arrived later in the next generation when they went back and fleshed Sigard out properly with a whole collecting mechanic. So for a long time Sigard was this creature that everyone knew was meant to be important, but that had never actually gotten to do anything important. The third guardian that mostly just sat in a cave. I find that genuinely interesting, because it tells you something about how these games came together. Xerneas and Yveltal are front and centre on the boxes, driving the whole plot. Sigard is clearly meant to be their equal, the leader of the trio even, and yet it got left on the shelf, waiting for a game that would finally use it properly, which, as it happens, is a fate that ended up being weirdly true of the entire Kalos region. But that's a thread for the very end of the night. For now, just picture the 3 of them. The rainbow deer of life, the blood-red bird of death, and the green serpent of order made of 1,000 little pieces coiled underground, keeping the peace between them. It's a lovely trio, honestly. Norse mythology filtered through a Pokémon lens and colour-coded like a television screen. Kalos really did aim high with its legendaries, but the deepest, saddest, most human story in these games doesn't belong to any of the 3 of them. It belongs to a man, a very tall, very old man, who's been carrying something heavy for longer than anyone should have to. You meet him without really meeting him at first. Somewhere out on your travels there's this enormous old man, unusually tall, a bit stooped, with a heavy sort of sadness hanging off him. He mutters something about a flower Pokémon and wanders off, and you think, all right, odd fellow, and you carry on. But that man turns out to be the emotional centre of the entire game, and his story is one of the quietest and most genuinely affecting things Pokémon has ever done. His name is AZ, and he's old. Not old like an elderly man is old. Old like 3,000 years. He was once the king of Kalos, back in an ancient time when the region was torn apart by a terrible war between 2 nations. And in the middle of all that, AZ had one thing he loved more than anything. A little Pokémon called Flute, one of those small flower creatures which had been a gift from his late mother. The 2 of them were inseparable. She was, by all accounts, his only real friend. And then the war took her. The soldiers came and conscripted Flute to fight, hauled her off to the front lines against AZ's wishes, because both sides believed that powerful Pokémon were what you needed to win. And Floette didn't come back. What came back was a small box, containing only the flower she used to carry. That was it. That was what was left. I find that detail unbearably sad, honestly. Not a body, not a grand tragedy, just a little box with a flower in it, sent home from a war she never should have been in. AZ was destroyed by it. And in his grief, he did what grieving people in stories sometimes do. He refused to accept it. He poured everything he had into building a machine, a device that could do the impossible and bring her back. And it worked. The machine restored Floette to life. It even did more than that. Because of the power involved, it granted both AZ and Floette a kind of immortality, and it left AZ changed, stretched to that unnatural height, marked forever by what he'd done. He got his friend back, and he got eternal life alongside her. On the face of it, a miracle. But here's the terrible part. The part that turns the whole thing from a happy ending into something much sadder. The machine had to be powered by something, and what it ran on was the life energy of other Pokémon. To bring one beloved creature back, a great many others had to be drained. AZ, in his grief, had built a machine that saved the one life he loved by taking countless others. And when Floette came back and understood what had been done, what had been sacrificed to return her, she was horrified. This wasn't the friend she remembered. She couldn't bear it. And so, after everything, after all of it, she left him. The one thing he'd torn the world apart to save simply turned and walked away, unable to look at what he'd become, which is, when you think about it, the cruelest possible outcome. He got exactly what he wanted, and it cost him the only thing that mattered. There's a whole quiet argument buried in that story about grief and what it drives people to, and about how far you're allowed to go to hold on to someone. And Pokémon, of all things, chose to tell it. A children's game about collecting monsters paused in the middle of all its skating and cafe battles to tell you a genuinely mournful story about a man who couldn't let go and lost everything twice because of it. I've always respected these games enormously for that. They didn't have to reach that deep. They did anyway. That's not where AZ's story ends, though. Not by a long way. Because what he did next, in his rage and his ruin, is the thing that connects him to the whole plot of the game you're actually playing thousands of years later. And then, much later still, there's the ending, which I'll save because it's the gentlest, loveliest note in the entire thing, and it deserves a bit of space to itself. So let's pick that up next. So there's AZ, immortal, towering, and utterly alone, standing in the wreckage of a war with his beloved Floette gone. And this is where grief curdles into something worse, because he didn't stop at the machine that brought her back. In his rage at the war that had taken her, he reshaped that same device into a weapon, a genuinely apocalyptic one, and he turned it on both sides of the conflict at once, and ended the war in the most final way imaginable. He'd built the thing to create a single life, and he twisted it into something that erased a great many. That weapon is a huge part of the story you stumble into all these centuries later, but we'll come to the modern day mess it causes when we get to the people trying to dig it back up. After that, there was nothing left for him but to wander. Immortal and heartbroken, AZ simply started walking, and he kept walking for centuries, and because he could never die and never quite forgive himself, he carried the key to that weapon around his neck the whole time, like a stone he'd chosen never to put down, a permanent reminder of the worst thing he ever did. There's something almost mythic about that image, a giant ageless man trudging across the world for thousands of years, wearing his guilt on a chain. Now here's a lovely bit of connective tissue, the kind of thing that makes the wider Pokémon world feel genuinely stitched together. AZ's wandering apparently took him all over the place, across regions and across time. In the games set in another region entirely, there's a giant tree planted in front of an important cave, and it's quietly implied that Aze is the tall visitor from a distant land who planted it long ago, while he was off researching the origins of mega evolution to satisfy his own restless curiosity. He even turns up in the background of one of that region's great legendary battles, watching from the edges. So this sad old Kalosian king has been quietly threaded through the history of multiple games, always at the margins, always watching, always searching. I love that. He's the series' great wanderer, and most players never even realise how far his footprints stretch. But let's come back to Kalos and to the ending, because this is the part I actually wanted to get to. All through the modern story, AZ is this melancholy figure at the edges, muttering about his flower. And at the very end, after you've become the champion of the whole region, after all the drama has settled, he approaches you, not with a threat, with a request. He wants to battle you, not out of malice, but because he wants to understand something. He's watched you and your Pokémon, and he wants to know what it actually means to be a trainer. What the bond between you and your creatures really is. Because whatever it is, he's clearly forgotten it, or never quite had it. So you battle, and you win. And when it's over, something in him finally settles. Seeing your bond with your Pokémon, understanding at last what he'd lost sight of, the weight he's been carrying for so long begins to lift. His heart, for the first time in an impossibly long while, opens up. And then in the quiet after the battle, there's a sparkle in the sky. His Floette, who was made immortal alongside him all those years ago, who's been out there somewhere all this time, senses the change in him, senses that he's finally become someone she can return to, and she comes back. After 3,000 years apart, she floats gently down into his waiting hands, and they're together again. I'm not going to oversell it. It's a quiet moment in a video game, but it lands. This ancient, ruined man who did a terrible thing for love and spent an eternity paying for it, finally gets a moment of peace and gets his friend back. All because he watched a kid be kind to their Pokémon and remembered what that felt like. There's no fanfare. It just happens, softly, at the edge of a celebration, and then it's over. And honestly, it's one of the most touching things Pokémon has ever put in a game. A whole story about grief and guilt and letting go, resolved not with a big battle, but with a returning flower. What I find genuinely warm about it is the message underneath, that the thing AZ couldn't buy with an apocalyptic machine, connection, forgiveness, peace, he got in the end simply by witnessing an ordinary bond between a young trainer and their team. The games spend all this time insisting that closeness is the real power in the world. AZ's story is where they prove it, not with fire, but with a flower coming home. Right, let's talk about the people who try to dig that terrible weapon back up, because they are, and I mean this sincerely, the best dressed villains in the entire series. Every Pokémon region has its baddies, its team of matching uniformed troublemakers with a daft plan. And Kalos, being Kalos, obsessed with beauty and fashion and looking the part, gave us the most stylish of the lot. Team Flare. And I have a lot of time for them purely on aesthetic grounds. The thing that hits you first about Team Flare is the outfits. All the grunts wear these sharp matching red suits with slick hair and sunglasses, looking less like a criminal gang and more like they've all wandered out of the same very expensive fashion show. They are, without question, the best dressed evil team in the series. Where other regions gave you pirates or ninjas or eco-warriors in colour-coordinated jumpsuits, Kalos gave you villainy as a luxury brand, which fits perfectly, because their whole ideology is twisted up with the idea of beauty, and they even swan around bragging about how much money they've spent. They're villains, but they're villains with a marketing budget. At the top of the whole operation is Lysandre, and he's a more interesting sort of bad guy than the outfits might suggest. Lysandre isn't in it for money or power, in the ordinary sense. He's a man who's looked at the world, decided it's overcrowded and ugly and heading for ruin, and concluded that the only way to preserve real beauty is to drastically reduce the number of living things in it. His plan, put bluntly, is to wipe out most of the life in the world so that a small chosen few can enjoy a cleaner, more beautiful, less crowded existence. And the way he intends to do it is by digging up and firing that ancient weapon we've just been talking about. The one AZ built and then buried in grief. That's the thread that ties the whole game together, and it's rather elegantly done. Team Flare wants to reactivate the ultimate weapon, and to power it, they need an enormous amount of energy, which is where the two great legendaries come in. The plan hinges on harnessing the life force channeled through Xerneas or Yveltal, depending on your game, to fuel the blast. So the life and death symbolism of the legendaries isn't just decoration, it's literally the fuel source for the villain's doomsday device. Everything loops back on itself. The weapon, the flower, the king, the deer, the bird, all of it connects. What makes Lysandre genuinely a bit chilling, rather than just silly, is that he's not entirely wrong about the problems he's pointing at. He's just arrived at a monstrous solution. He talks about a world running out of room and resources, which isn't nonsense, and then decides the answer is to simply delete most of it. It's the kind of villain logic that starts from something you can almost nod along to and then drives straight off a cliff. He also runs a whole media and technology operation on the side, a communications network that keeps everyone plugged in, which gives him this slightly modern, unsettling flavour. He's not a warlord, he's more like a tech billionaire who's decided he knows best, which, depending on when you're watching this, might feel a little too familiar. Standing against all that, at the top of the region, is the champion, and she's a lovely bit of casting for a beauty-obsessed place. Her name is Diantha, and she isn't just the strongest trainer in Kalos, she's also a famous movie star, an actual celebrity, glamorous and poised, who happens to also be the region's ultimate battling challenge. And her signature Pokémon is a Mega Gardevoir, that elegant psychic fairy in its flowing gown of a megaform, which suits her whole film star image beautifully. There's something very Kalos about your final opponent being a movie star, with the most graceful Pokémon in the region. Even the boss fight is fashionable. The contrast between the two of them is quite deliberate, I think. Lysandre wants to impose a cold, narrow idea of beauty on the world by force, by deciding who gets to exist. Diantha embodies a warmer version of it. Beauty as something you share, something you perform for people, something joyful. The game sets up its whole beauty theme, and then gives you two very different answers to the question of what beauty is actually for. One says it's a thing to be hoarded and protected by wiping out the rest. The other just makes films and battles gracefully and lets everyone enjoy it. I know which side I'm on. Team Flare do lose, of course, in the end, and their plan falls apart, and AZ gets his quiet redemption in the aftermath. But for a fashion-forward gang of doom-mongers in red suits, they left a real impression. Best-dressed villains in the series, hands down. Now, we've mentioned a couple of the region's gym leaders in passing. Let's take a slow wander through the rest of them, because they're a genuinely charming bunch. The gym leaders of Kalos are a lovely little cast, and since a sleepy tour is exactly what we're doing tonight, let's just stroll through them one by one. They each have a job or a hobby that isn't battling, which I've always liked because it makes them feel like actual people who happen to run a gym on the side rather than just obstacles with badges. The first one you meet is Viola, and she's a photographer. Her whole gym is done up like a giant camera and studio, and she talks about battles the way a photographer talks about a good shot, all about capturing the decisive moment. She uses bug types which are a classic first gym choice, gentle enough to learn on. There's something charming about your very first proper challenge in the region, being a woman who mostly wants to take nice pictures. Then there's Grant, over in the seaside city, who's basically a rock climber. He's all about scaling cliffs and pushing himself up sheer walls, so naturally he uses rock types, and his gym leans into that climbing theme. He's earnest and sporty, and a bit of a health nut, the sort who probably has strong opinions about protein. After him, you meet Karina, who we've already spent time with, the roller skating fighting type leader with her beloved Lucario, the one who hands you the whole mega evolution business. She's a bundle of energy and easily one of the most memorable of the lot. Further along there's Ramos, and he's my quiet favourite, honestly. He's this old weathered groundskeeper, a gardener really, who tends his plants and speaks in this gentle grandfatherly way. He uses grass types, obviously, and his whole gym is built around ropes and greenery, like an enormous overgrown playground. There's a real calm to him. He feels like someone who's been quietly looking after growing things for a very long time and has made his peace with the world. The Lumio City Gym belongs to Clement, and he's an inventor, all gadgets and gizmos and slightly too clever contraptions that don't always work. He uses electric types, which suits the whole tinkering with machines vibe, and his gym is tucked inside that Eiffel Tower stand-in, Prism Tower, right in the heart of the city. If you've ever watched the animated series from around this era, you'll know him well, because he became a main character in it, a bespectacled boy genius with a habit of his own inventions blowing up in his face. Over in Lavair City, there's Valerie, and she's wonderful. She's a fashion designer, elegant, and a bit otherworldly, and she uses the new fairy types, which is a perfect match for a beauty-obsessed region, introducing a beauty-adjacent type. What I love about her is that within the game's world, she's fascinated by a far-off distant region and its traditions, which is a quiet little nod to Japan from a game that's otherwise entirely about France. So you've got this French region fashion designer who's quietly obsessed with Japanese style. A nice bit of cross-cultural admiration hidden in a gym. Near the end, you meet Olympia, a serene, mystical, psychic-type leader who speaks in these calm, prophetic riddles and seems to drift half a step outside ordinary time. Her gym is all glowing lights and floating platforms and cosmic atmosphere. She's the sort of character who tells you your future in a soft voice and leaves you slightly unsure whether she was being profound or just a bit strange. Either way, she fits the dreamy tone of the late game beautifully. And the final gym leader, up in the snowy corner we talked about earlier, is Wulfric. He's a big, warm, bear of a man who uses ice types. And he's got this reputation as a tough final wall before the league. But he's not cold, despite the typing. He's actually quite jolly and sincere, the kind of last challenge who shakes your hand and means it. A gentle giant guarding the last badge in the coldest town on the map. What ties them all together, for me, is how human they feel. A photographer, a climber, a gardener, an inventor, a fashion designer, a mystic, and a good-natured bear of a man. None of them are just battlers. They've all got lives and passions outside the gym, and the game takes little moments to let that show. It makes the whole region feel populated by actual people, rather than a checklist of fights. Which again, is very Kalos. Even the opponents are meant to be charming. Right, we've done people for a while. Let's get back to the Pokémon themselves, and specifically to some of the genuinely daft ways this generation asked you to evolve them. Pokémon has always had some slightly odd ways of evolving creatures. Trade this one, give that one a stone, level this one up somewhere very specific. But Kalos gave us what might be the single most ridiculous evolution method in the whole series, and I mean that with total affection. To evolve a little squid called Inkay into its bigger form, Malamar, you have to physically turn your console upside down. Let me say that again, because it deserves it. You level Inkay up to the right point, and then, at the moment of evolution, you have to be holding your 3DS upside down. Flip the whole machine over in your hands. That's the trigger. The game uses the console's built-in motion sensor to check which way up you're holding it, and if it's inverted, the evolution goes through. It's completely bananas, and I adore it. Now, there's a lovely bit of history behind why this exists, and it's the kind of thing that makes me smile every time. Way back in the days of the very first Pokémon games, there was an old April Fool's joke going around, a fake rumour that you could evolve Lickitung into Luigi, of all things, by feeding it a rare sweet while holding your Game Boy upside down. Complete nonsense, obviously, a prank, but the joke stuck around in Pokémon folklore for years. And then decades later, the developers apparently decided to make a wink at it real. Inkay's upside-down evolution is almost certainly a nod to that old prank. The rumour was that Nintendo themselves helped start the original joke, which makes it even better. They told a lie about upside-down evolutions as a laugh, and then, 20-odd years on, quietly made it true. That's a long game to play for a punchline, and I respect it enormously. Fans being fans, of course, people immediately tried to come up with an in-universe reason for why turning the console over would make a squid evolve. And the theories are genuinely charming in their overthinking. The general idea some people landed on is that Inkay and Malamar have this split nature to them, part psychic, part dark, and that flipping it over does something to how that energy flows through it, forcing it to change to cope. A bit like how blood rushes to your head when you hang upside down, and your body has to adjust. It's all nonsense, of course. The real answer is just that the 3DS had a motion sensor, and the developers thought it would be funny. But I love that players cared enough to invent physics for it. What I find genuinely delightful about this is what it says about the generation as a whole. Kalos was the moment Pokémon really embraced the hardware it was running on. The console could sense motion, could tell which way up it was, and rather than let that sit unused, the developers built a little joke evolution around it. It's playful in a way the games hadn't always been. They looked at the machine in your hands and thought, right, what silly thing can we do with this? And the answer was a squid that only grows up when the world's turned over. There's a small practical comedy to it too, that I always think about. If you're evolving your Inkay, you've got to hold the console upside down, which means for a moment you can't actually read the screen properly. So you're sitting there, machine flipped, squinting at an inverted evolution animation, trying to work out if it's actually happening. It's a genuinely awkward little bit of theatre, and it turns a routine evolution into this small silly ritual. I can't be the only person who sat there with a 3DS held over my head, like an idiot, waiting for a squid to sort itself out. Malamar itself, for the record, turned out to be genuinely decent, which is a nice bonus. It's got an unusual typing and some sneaky tricks up its tentacles, so it wasn't just a novelty. The joke evolution produced a creature people actually wanted to use, which doesn't always happen with these gimmicky things. But even if it had been useless, I'd have kept one around purely for the story of how I got it. Inkay isn't the only Pokémon in Kalos with an odd path to growing up, mind. A few others have their own strange requirements, tangled up with the region's whole French flavour of perfume and pastry. So let's talk about those next, because they're a bit sweeter in every sense. Since we're on the topic of odd ways to grow up, Kalos had a couple more that lean hard into its French flavour, and they're rather lovely once you know the logic. Take Spritzy, a little fairy-type bird that smells nice. That's genuinely its whole thing. It gives off a pleasant aroma. To evolve it into Aromatisse, you have to trade it to another player while it's holding a special item called a sachet, which is basically a little bag of perfume. And its counterpart, Swirlix, a fluffy white creature that looks like a ball of candy floss, evolves into Slurpuff when traded while holding a whipped dream, which is exactly what it sounds like, a dollop of dessert. So one evolves through perfume, and the other through pastry, which is about the most French pair of evolution methods you could possibly design. Fragrance and sweets. Of course, that's how you grow up in a region based on France. I find it genuinely charming that the developers looked at these two and thought, well, one should smell nice, and one should be delicious. and built the whole mechanic around that. There's a nice bit of theming in the whole trade with an item business too. It ties back to that recurring Kalos idea that connection matters. You can't just evolve these two on your own by grinding levels. You have to trade them, to hand them off to someone else, for the change to happen. So even the perfume and pastry Pokémon are quietly built around the notion that growth involves other people. It's a small thing, but it fits the region's whole personality. Nobody grows up entirely alone in Kalos, not even the fluffy dessert. Then there's Pumpkaboo, which does something completely different, and, honestly, a bit odd. Pumpkaboo is a little ghostly pumpkin creature, and it comes in 4 different sizes. Not 4 different forms with different powers really, just 4 sizes. Small, average, large, and super size. An actual size chart for a pumpkin. And when it evolves into Gourgeist, it keeps whatever size it started as, so you end up with small Gourgeists and enormous Gourgeists depending on which Pumpkaboo you happen to catch. It's a genuinely strange design decision, because the size does tweak its stats a little, so a tiny fast one plays differently from a big slow one, but mostly it just means your ghost pumpkin can be pocket-sized or absolutely massive. I love the mental image of a trainer specifically hunting for the biggest possible Pumpkaboo, like they're at a village fete trying to win the prize marrow. There's a seasonal loveliness to Pumpkaboo and Gourgeist as well, obviously. They're the Halloween Pokémon of the generation, all jack-o'-lantern faces and spooky little grins and drifting ghost light, and they lean into that autumn harvest festival feeling that a lot of Kalos has, especially out in the regions of the map based on the French countryside, where it always seems to be a golden sort of autumn. Wandering through fallen leaves, with a floating pumpkin trailing behind you, is a very cosy way to spend an evening, if you ask me. What I like about all these fiddly evolution methods, taken together, is how much personality they pack into what could have been dull mechanics. Any game can say level this up to 20, and it evolves. Kalos said, no, this one evolves when you turn the console over. This one when you trade it holding perfume. This one when you trade it holding cake. And this one comes in a range of sizes, like it's on a menu. None of it is necessary. All of it is flavour. And flavour, in a region built entirely around being charming, is sort of the whole point. It does mean that if you were the kind of player who wanted to catch and evolve absolutely everything, Kalos quietly asked quite a lot of you. You needed friends to trade with, the right little items, a willingness to hold your machine upside down in public, and a good eye for pumpkin sizes. But that effort came wrapped in so much personality that it never felt like a chore. It felt like the region showing off, which it did constantly, and mostly got away with. Now, some of Kalos' most interesting creatures didn't come from any of these methods at all. They came out of the ground, reconstructed from ancient bones, which is a whole different kind of strange. So let's dig up some fossils. Fossils have been a quiet little sideline in these games for about as long as I can remember. You find some old bones, you take them to a lab, and they bring them back to life as a living creature. It's a bit mad when you say it out loud, resurrecting extinct monsters from rocks, but it's been part of the game since the very start. And Kalos gave us 2 of the nicest fossil Pokémon in the whole series. And, in true Kalos fashion, it made you pick between them. Down in the seaside town of Ambiment, near a coast full of old rock, you're offered a choice of 2 fossils. There's the jaw fossil and the sail fossil, and you can only take one, so right away you've got that little pang of having to leave one behind. The jaw fossil gives you Tyrant, and the sail fossil gives you Amora, and the 2 of them could hardly be more different in mood. Tyrant is a baby Tyrannosaurus. That's basically it, and it's brilliant. It's this stompy, grumpy little dinosaur, all jaws and attitude, and it's a rock and dragon type. When it grows up into Tyrantrum, it becomes a proper king of the dinosaurs sort of beast, a great toothy predator with a genuinely regal air about it. And the developers gave it the classic Tyrannosaurus joke, the tiny little arms. Tyrantrum is this fearsome ancient royal monster with these adorably useless little arms tucked up at the front, and I think that contrast is genuinely funny. Terrifying jaws, ridiculous arms, nature's own comedy timing. Amora is the other end of the emotional scale entirely. It's a gentle, long-necked, sail-backed creature in soft blues, and it's a rock and ice type, which gives it this lovely cold, prehistoric tundra feeling. It's based on a real dinosaur, with a distinctive sail or ridge along its body, and its name and design carry this chilly, far northern quality, like something that wandered out of an ice age. When it evolves into Aurorus, it becomes this serene, elegant thing with these beautiful frills that can shimmer like the northern lights. The name even nods to the aurora, those ribbons of light in polar skies. So where Tyrant is a grumpy little predator, Amora is this graceful, sad-eyed creature of the cold. One's a warm-blooded terror, the other's an icy, gentle giant. Here's a nice touch in how they evolve too, and it fits them perfectly. Tyrant, the aggressive dinosaur, evolves during the day, in the light and heat, which suits its whole sunlit predator energy. And Amora, the creature of ice and quiet, evolves at night, under the cold, dark sky, which suits its whole Aurora theme beautifully. So even the timing of their growing up is themed. The daytime beast and the nighttime beauty. I love when the mechanics quietly reinforce the personality like that. It would have been so easy to just make them both evolve at the same level and be done with it. Instead, one waits for the sun and one waits for the stars. There's a gentle little tragedy baked into all fossil Pokémon, if you sit with it, which suits a sleepy, late-night ramble. These are creatures that died out long, long ago, brought back into a world that moved on without them. Aurorus especially has this melancholy, out-of-time quality, like it half remembers an age of ice that's gone forever. Kalos, a region so wrapped up in ideas of life and death and things passing and returning, is a rather fitting place to go digging up the ancient dead. Even the fossils are quietly on theme. The choice between them is the sort of small, pleasant agony these games are good at. Do you want the grumpy king with the silly arms or the graceful, frilled creature of the cold? There's no wrong answer, but you can only take one fossil home, so you have to actually decide. And of course, being Pokémon, you can always trade with someone who made the opposite choice, so nobody has to go without forever. But in the moment, standing in that seaside town, it's a genuine little dilemma. I always went Amora, personally. Something about that sad, gentle, aurora-frilled face got me every time. Right, let's talk about a creature whose whole gimmick depends not on which fossil you pick, or which way up you hold your console, but on where in the actual world you happen to be sitting. Because that one's genuinely wild. Here's one of my favourite pieces of quiet Kalos cleverness, and it's the sort of thing that genuinely surprised people when they worked it out. There's a butterfly Pokémon called Vivillon, and the pattern on its wings depends on where in the real world you actually are. Let me explain, because it's lovely. Vivillon starts as a little caterpillar called Scatterbug, evolves into a cocoon, and then becomes this pretty butterfly. And when it hatches into Vivillon, the pattern on its wings isn't random, and it isn't the same for everyone. The game quietly checks the region your console is set to, based on your real-world location, and hands you the wing pattern that belongs to that part of the planet. So a player in one country gets one design, a player in another country gets a completely different one. And there are around 20 of these patterns scattered across the globe. There's a snowy one for colder regions, a sandy one for hotter parts of the world, a whole spread of them, each tied to a real geographic area. I find that genuinely delightful. Most of what a game knows about you stays inside the game. Vivillon reaches out and grabs a little piece of the actual world where you happen to be sitting right now and paints it onto a butterfly's wings. Your Vivillon is, in a small way, a souvenir of your own corner of the planet. Two people playing the exact same game in different countries end up with visibly different creatures, and neither of them did anything special to earn it. They just live where they live, which naturally turned Vivillon into a bit of a collector's obsession, because the only way to get all the patterns was to get hold of Vivillon from players all over the world. If someone traded you their caterpillar from another country, it would grow into their region's pattern, not yours. So people started trading across borders specifically to collect butterflies from as many places as possible. This lovely little global exchange built entirely around a bug's wings. There's something quite sweet about that. Players in different countries swapping butterflies just so they could own a scrap of somewhere they'd never been. A quiet bit of international pen pal energy, hidden inside a Pokémon game. There were a couple of extra special patterns too, the rarest of the rare. A fancy pattern and a Pokeball pattern, which weren't tied to any location at all and could only be given out through special events. And here's the slightly sad footnote for the completists. Those event-only patterns were, for the most part, never actually distributed during these games' lifetime. So for a long time, if you wanted the full set, there were a couple of butterflies you simply couldn't get, no matter how much you traded or travelled. They existed in the code, waiting, but the door to them stayed shut. It took later games to finally let people catch them. There's something a bit haunting about a butterfly that officially exists, but that almost nobody could ever obtain, fluttering around just out of reach. What I love about the whole Vivillon idea is how gently it plays with the boundary between the game and the real world. It doesn't make a fuss about it. It doesn't put up a big message saying, "Look, we know where you are." It just quietly decides your butterfly based on your patch of the globe and lets you notice, or not. And if you do notice, it makes the world feel a little bigger and a little more connected. The idea that your Vivillon and a stranger's Vivillon on the other side of the planet are the same species wearing the colours of two different homes. It also fits Kalos perfectly, when you think about it. A region obsessed with beauty, giving you a beautiful creature whose beauty is literally shaped by where you come from. Your wings are pretty, and they're pretty in the particular way your part of the world is pretty. That's a genuinely poetic idea to hang on a bug, and it's exactly the kind of quiet, thoughtful touch that makes this generation stick in my memory. Vivillon isn't the only Pokémon in Kalos with a look that changes over time or place either. There's a fluffy little poodle that you can groom into all sorts of styles, and a couple of other odd designs worth a mention. So let's have a quick fuss over those. Kalos being France, it was almost obligatory that we'd get a poodle. And we did. It's called Furfru, and it might be the most French Pokémon ever made, because its entire gimmick is grooming. Furfru is a fluffy normal type dog, and if you take it to a salon in the game, you can have it groomed into all sorts of elaborate styles. There's a whole menu of trims, a heart-shaped cut, a star, a regal one, a fancy one, a kabuki-inspired one, even a pharaoh style that makes it look like it's wandered off an Egyptian tomb. So your poodle can be a little walking work of topiary, clipped into whatever shape takes your fancy. It's pure indulgence, the sort of feature that does nothing for battling and everything for charm, which is about as on-brand for this region as it gets. A beauty region gave you a dog you could style. Of course it did. Here's the catch that always made me laugh though. The grooming doesn't last. After a handful of days, your beautifully clipped poodle's fur grows back out, and it reverts to its natural, scruffy default, and you have to trot back to the salon and do it all again. Which is, when you think about it, exactly how real grooming works. You pay for the fancy cut, you look magnificent for a bit, and then it grows out and you're back to square one. There's something quietly funny about a video game modelling the sheer maintenance of vanity that faithfully. Beauty is a full-time job in Kalos, even for the dog. While we're on odd little designs, Kalos also gave us Klefki, which is genuinely a Pokémon that is a set of keys. A key ring specifically, a steel and fairy type that's a little floating ring with keys jangling off it. And when it first turned up, a lot of people were, let's say, unkind. It became a bit of a poster child for the idea that the designers had run out of inspiration, that they'd started just turning household objects into creatures. A living keyring, honestly. But here's the thing, Klefki grew on people enormously. It's got a cheeky little face, it collects keys like a magpie, and it turned out to be surprisingly useful in battle thanks to some annoying tricks it can pull. So the Pokémon everyone mocked at first became a quiet fan favourite, which I always enjoy. Never write off the keyring. And then, at the other end of the coolness scale, there's the sword. Kalos introduced a steel and ghost type called Honedge, which is quite simply a haunted sword. It's an old blade with an eye and a wisp of cloth, possessed by a spirit, and the lore around it is properly creepy in that fun, campfire sort of way. It's said to attach itself to people and drain their energy, the classic cursed weapon idea. It evolves into Doublade, which is 2 swords, and then finally into Aegislash, which is one of the coolest designs of the generation, a sword and shield spirit that can switch between an aggressive blade stance and a defensive shield stance right in the middle of battle. A Pokémon that's literally a suit of animate weaponry, switching between attack and defense like a duelist. Given how much medieval history and old European castle imagery Kalos is soaked in, a haunted royal sword feels absolutely right. Every good castle needs a cursed blade rattling around in it somewhere. What I like about this little cluster of Pokémon is how much range it shows. In the same region, you've got a poodle you can style for fun, a keyring that everyone laughed at and then grew to love, and a genuinely menacing possessed sword that became one of the most respected creatures of its era. Silly, sweet and spooky, all sharing the same map, Kalos never really committed to one tone, and I think that's part of its charm. It could be a fashion show one minute and a haunted castle the next, and somehow it all held together under that big umbrella idea of beauty in all its forms. That range, that willingness to be lots of things at once, was possible partly because this generation was such a huge technical leap for the series. These were the games where Pokémon fully stepped into 3 dimensions for the first time, and it changed how everything looked and felt. So let's talk about that jump, because it was a genuinely big deal at the time. For a long time, Pokémon had a very particular look. Little flat sprites drawn pixel by pixel shuffling about on a grid. That's how it had been, more or less. From the very first games right through to the 5th generation. It was charming and iconic and beloved, but it was flat. And then Kalos arrived and blew all of that wide open, because Pokémon X and Y were the games where the whole series finally stepped into full 3 dimensions. This was, genuinely, the biggest visual overhaul the franchise had ever attempted. They took the entire look of the games, all those beloved flat sprites, and rebuilt everything as proper 3D models. Suddenly your Pokémon weren't little pixel drawings anymore. They were fully modelled creatures that moved and turned and had actual depth. Standing on a battlefield, you could see around. For anyone who'd grown up with the flat sprite versions, that first battle in 3D was a bit of a moment. Your Pokémon, the ones you'd known as little pictures your whole life, suddenly standing there in the round, breathing, shifting their weight. It genuinely felt like a new era, and the scale of the work behind it was enormous. This wasn't a small update. Pulling off that jump took a team of well over 500 people, and part of the job was going back and converting more than 700 existing Pokémon, every creature from every previous generation, into brand new 3D models. Think about that for a second. Every single Pokémon that had ever existed, rebuilt from scratch as a model, animated, given weight and personality in 3 dimensions. That's a colossal undertaking, years of careful work, just to make sure that when you finally saw your old favourites in 3D, they looked and moved the way they were meant to. I have enormous respect for that kind of patient, invisible labour. Most players never think about it, they just battle. But someone somewhere spent a very long time making sure your Charizard flapped correctly. What impresses me is how much care went into keeping the soul of the thing intact through all that. It would have been easy for the switch to 3D to strip away the hand-drawn charm that Pokémon had always had. but they worked hard to preserve the signature style of the series. That particular look the art director had been shaping since the very beginning, even as they moved into a whole new kind of technology. They used clever little tricks with the outlines and the shading to keep that slightly storybook hand-drawn feeling alive in 3 dimensions. So it felt new without feeling like a betrayal, which is a genuinely difficult balance to strike. Plenty of long-running series have made the jump to 3D and lost themselves in the process. Pokémon mostly didn't. There's one lovely detail about how these games came out that I always think is worth mentioning too. Pokémon X and Y were released across the whole world at essentially the same time, which sounds unremarkable now, but it hadn't really been done before for a main Pokémon game. Previously, Japan would get the games first, and everyone else would wait months, sometimes the best part of a year, for the translation. Kalos changed that. For the first time, players everywhere got to start their adventure together on the same day, in their own language. So you had this genuinely global moment, millions of people, all over the planet, stepping into this France-shaped region for the first time at once. Given that this was also the generation obsessed with connection and bonds, there's something rather fitting about it being the one where the whole world got to begin together. The move to 3D wasn't just about looking prettier, either. It opened up things the flat games simply couldn't do. Battles could be more dramatic and cinematic. That big mega evolution spectacle we talked about earlier only really works because everything was in 3D now, with the room to show a proper transformation. And, as we'll get into, it let the developers add a whole load of new features that leaned on you being able to see and interact with your Pokémon as actual present creatures rather than distant little sprites. The technology and the ideas fed each other. Speaking of those new features, this generation didn't just change how Pokémon looked. It changed how you moved through the world, and even how you dressed. So let's talk about the first time a Pokémon game let you decide what your own character actually looked like. Here's a change that sounds small, but genuinely mattered to a lot of people. Kalos was the first main Pokémon game that let you actually customize your own character. Before this, you played as a fixed kid. You picked boy or girl, and that was your lot. The hair, the clothes, the face, all decided for you. But in a region obsessed with fashion, that clearly wasn't going to fly. So for the first time, they handed you the wardrobe keys. You could choose your character's skin tone, style their hair, pick out clothes, mix and match outfits, and generally make the trainer look a bit more like you, or at least like someone you'd actually want to be. And Lumio City, being the fashion capital, was full of boutiques where you could buy new gear, with the fancier shops only letting you in once you'd proven yourself a bit. Which is a cheeky but very Parisian touch. There's a real joy in being able to dress your own trainer. Honestly, it's the kind of thing that makes the adventure feel like yours rather than a story you're borrowing. And it became such a beloved feature that it stuck around in every mainline game afterwards. Kalos started that. The whole series learned here that people want to look like themselves. Getting around got a stylish upgrade too, and this one I have a real soft spot for. Early on, before you've even beaten the first gym, the game hands you a pair of roller skates. Not a bike, not just running. Roller skates. And you glide around the whole region on them, swooping through towns and along routes, and if you're good with the controls, you can pull off little tricks and spins. It's genuinely lovely to move around in. There's a flow to it that the old walk and bike setup never had. Skating through a French-inspired city, weaving past cafes, doing the odd spin for no reason. It's just a nice way to exist in a game. Very of its moment, too. Very that particular era of effortless cool. And then there's riding Pokémon, which was a small revolution in its own quiet way. In earlier games, when you crossed water using a Pokémon, you'd sort of magically glide along on a generic little sprite that didn't really look like anything. Kalos changed that. If you crossed the water on a Lapras, you actually saw yourself riding a Lapras sitting on its shell as it swam. It sounds obvious, but it hadn't been done properly before, and it made the world feel so much more real. Your Pokémon weren't abstract tools anymore. They were creatures you climbed onto. It went further than water too. Out on the routes there were specific Pokémon you could hop on to get around tricky terrain. There's a Rhyhorn you can ride to smash through rocky ground, a Marmoswine that carries you over deep snow, and a Skiddo on a little farm you can practice riding, before graduating to its bigger evolved form, Go-Goat, which you can actually ride around Lumiose City itself, trotting through the streets on a great leafy goat, which is, I think, one of the more wonderfully absurd images the series has produced. There you are, in a city based on Paris, casually riding an enormous goat past the Eiffel Tower stand-in. Nobody bats an eye. It's completely normal. I adore it. All of these things, the customization, the skating, the riding, point at the same underlying idea. Kalos wanted you to feel present in its world, and to feel like a specific person moving through it, not just a cursor pushing through a grid. The move to 3D made your Pokémon feel real, and all these little touches made you feel real too. You had a face you chose, an outfit you picked, skates on your feet, and a goat to ride into town. It's a generation that cared a great deal about the texture of just being somewhere lovely, which for a sleepy wander like tonight suits me right down to the ground. There's another feature from this era that fits the whole Bonds theme even more directly though, and it's the one that let you actually reach into the screen and fuss over your Pokémon like a pet. We touched on it earlier with Sylveon. Now let's give it its proper moment, because it did more than just look cute. We've circled this a couple of times now, so let's finally sit down with it. Kalos introduced a feature called Pokémon Army, and it let you, for the first time, properly interact with your Pokémon as if they were pets. And the name itself is a lovely little bilingual pun, because army is French for friend. Say it out loud, and it's basically mon ami, my friend, which is about as neat a bit of naming as you could ask for in a France-based region. In the original Japanese, it was named around the French word for talking too, so either way, it's a feature that wears its French heart on its sleeve. What you actually do in it is delightfully simple. You bring up one of your Pokémon on the screen, and you can pet it, stroke it, feed it little sweets, called Poképuffs, and play small games with it. And the Pokémon reacts. It leans into being stroked, or looks delighted at a treat, or gets a bit grumpy if you poke somewhere it doesn't like. It's pure, uncomplicated affection, this quiet little space where the battling stops and you just spend time with your creatures. As someone who finds the actual fighting the least interesting part of Pokémon half the time, I always loved having a corner of the game that was just about being fond of them. But here's the genuinely clever bit, the thing that stops it from being a pointless novelty. All that affection actually feeds back into battles. A Pokémon you've built up a strong bond with through Pokémon Amy starts doing remarkable things when it fights for you. It lands critical hits more often. It'll sometimes dodge an attack that should have hit, purely out of what the game frames, as not wanting to let you down. It'll occasionally hang on with a single point of health when it really should have fainted, refusing to go down because it's trying so hard for you. It can even shake off things like being frozen or put to sleep on its own, and it earns a bit more experience along the way. So the closer you are to your Pokémon, the harder it fights, and the luckier it seems to get. I think that's a genuinely beautiful bit of design, because it takes the whole abstract theme of the generation, this insistence that bonds are the real source of power, and turns it into something you can actually feel in a battle. It's not just a line of dialogue anymore. Your carefully loved Pokémon literally survives hits that should have killed it, dodges attacks it has no business dodging, because you spent time being kind to it. The game rewards affection with loyalty, and it does it right there in the moment when it matters most. There's something quite moving about watching a creature you've fussed over cling to life at one health point and then turn the battle around. It feels earned in a way that a pure numbers boost never quite would. And of course this is the same system that produces a Sylveon, that Eevee we talked about way back, that changes shape out of sheer fondness. Same underlying idea, same warmth. Kalos kept finding different ways to say the one thing it really believed, which is that closeness makes things stronger. The mega evolutions leaned on it. The fairy type was wrapped up in it. AZ's whole tragic story turned on it. And here, in Pokémon Amy, it's at its most direct and gentlest. Be kind to your Pokémon, and they'll fight the harder for you. There's a soft, slightly funny side to it as well. Because the games track things like whether your Pokémon is smiling, you'd sometimes find yourself sitting there at the end of a long day, just stroking a digital creature to cheer it up, watching it beam back at you. It's a very low stakes, very cozy thing to do, and honestly, not a bad way to wind down. A little pocket of pure niceness in amongst all the battling and collecting. I've spent more time than I'd like to admit just petting a sleepy-looking Pokémon and feeding it cakes, and I don't regret a second of it. Kalos was full of new systems and features beyond just this one, mind. There was a whole raft of extra things layered on top, from training tools to unusual battle formats. So let's run through a few of those, because a couple of them are genuinely interesting, and one of them speaks to something surprising about this generation. This generation threw in a whole grab bag of new features, some of which stuck around and some of which quietly vanished. And it's fun to potter through them because they show a series experimenting with what all that new 3D power could do. There was super training for a start, which was this whole mini-game system for strengthening your Pokemon's hidden stats. Instead of the old, rather opaque business of grinding against specific creatures to build up invisible values, you got these little football-style training exercises where you'd shoot balls at big balloon opponents on the touchscreen. It made a famously dry technical bit of Pokemon raising into something you could actually see and do with your hands. Whether it was better is a matter of taste, but I appreciated the effort to drag one of the game's most hidden systems out into the light where newcomers could actually understand it. Then there were sky battles, which were genuinely strange. These were special battles that could only involve Pokemon capable of flying or floating, so your grounded creatures were shut out entirely, and you'd fight these aerial-only duels up in the air against certain trainers. It was a neat idea in theory, a whole battle type restricted to things that could get off the ground, but in practice it was quite limited, and it's one of those features that never really came back. A charming experiment that didn't quite find its feet, or perhaps didn't want feet at all. Given the whole point, horde encounters were more successful, and a bit more chaotic. Sometimes, instead of running into a single wild Pokemon, you'd get ambushed by a whole swarm of them at once. 5 little creatures piling in against your one. It made the wild world feel busier and a bit more alive, like the grass was actually full of things rather than dispensing them one at a time. It also turned into a handy way to train, since you could rack up experience against a crowd, and it added these small moments of mild panic when a peaceful walk suddenly became you against 5 angry critters. I liked those. They gave the routes a bit of unpredictability. There was also a whole online layer, a system that kept you loosely connected to other players around the world as you wandered, letting you trade and battle and share things fairly seamlessly, which fit the generation's big theme of connection nicely. It made the world feel like it had other people quietly moving through it, even when you were off on your own. But here's the fact about this generation that genuinely surprises people, and it fits the mood of a quiet late-night ramble. For all its ambition, all its 3D grandeur and new features and new type, Kalos actually introduced the fewest brand new Pokémon of any generation. Only 72 new species. That's it. Compare that to some earlier generations that brought in well over 150 each, and it's a striking drop. 72. And when you think about why, it makes complete sense. This was the generation that had to rebuild every single existing Pokémon in 3D. That whole enormous conversion job we talked about. So an awful lot of the effort that might normally have gone into designing a big pile of new creatures went instead into remaking the old ones and building all these new systems. They spent their energy on the leap into 3 dimensions rather than on sheer numbers, which means Kalos is this slightly unusual generation that changed almost everything about how Pokémon looked and felt, while adding relatively few actual new Pokémon to the pile. It reinvented the presentation more than the roster. I find that oddly fitting for a region so focused on beauty and craft over quantity. It didn't try to overwhelm you with hundreds of new faces. It gave you a smaller, carefully chosen set and spent its real effort on making everything, old and new alike, look and move more beautifully than ever before. Quality over quantity, you might say, which is a very fashionable French attitude to take when you think about it. Better to do a few things gorgeously than a great many things adequately. Of that modest batch of newcomers, a small handful were the rarest and most mysterious of all, the ones most players never even got their hands on. The mythical Pokémon. There were 3 of them tied to this generation, and each one has its own strange little story. So let's spend some time with those before the night winds down. The mythical Pokémon of any generation are the rare, special ones, the event-only creatures most players never actually get, handed out through limited giveaways rather than found in the grass. And Kalos had 3 of them. The first and the prettiest is Diancie. Diancie is a rock and fairy type, and it's genuinely gorgeous. It's this small pink princess-like creature covered in jewels, with a crown of diamonds and a body that glitters. Its whole thing is that it's associated with the loveliest sight in the world, which is a bold claim, but look at it and you sort of go, all right, fair enough. It's the kind of design that fits Kalos like a glove, a region obsessed with beauty, producing a mythical Pokémon whose entire identity is being beautiful. Here's the lovely bit of lore though. Diancie isn't a fresh creature from nowhere. It's a transformed version of an ordinary Pokémon called Carbink, which is this little rocky, gem-studded creature you can actually find in the caves of Kalos. Carbink is common enough, a plain grey rock with a few jewels in it, trundling around underground. And every so often, under the right conditions, one of them changes, refines itself, and becomes a Diancie. So Diancie is essentially what happens when a humble little cave rock becomes something dazzling. There's a real fairy tale quality to that. The ordinary stone that turns into a jeweled princess. It's Cinderella more or less, if Cinderella were a mineral. And it can create diamonds. In the lore, Diancie can compress the carbon in the air with its own hands and produce diamonds out of nothing, which is a genuinely magical little ability. It later even got its own Mega evolution, becoming even more elaborate and radiant, all sharp crystal and pink light. So this creature that started as a plain cave rock ends up, at its most powerful, as one of the most spectacular looking things in the entire game. That's quite a glow up, from grey pebble to mega evolved jeweled royalty. Because it was a mythical though, you couldn't just go and catch one in the wild. Diancie was handed out through special distribution events, tied in with a film it starred in, so getting one meant being in the right place at the right time when the giveaway was running. Which is the slightly bittersweet reality of these mythicals. They're the loveliest, rarest things in the game, and precisely because of that, loads of players never actually owned one. They existed as this shimmering rumour at the edge of the Pokédex, a princess you'd heard about but might never meet. What I find quietly charming about Diancie is how neatly it embodies the whole spirit of Kalos in one creature. Take something ordinary, an unremarkable rock, refine it, care for it, let it change, and it becomes beautiful, and then, with a little more power, breathtaking. That's the region's entire philosophy about beauty and transformation, wrapped up in a single, pink jewel of a Pokémon. It's not beauty you're born with, it's beauty you become. And a plain cave rock turning into a diamond princess is about as clean a version of that idea as you could hope to design. There's also just something soothing about Deontay as an image, which suits tonight. This small, glittering, gentle creature drifting through caves, quietly turning air into diamonds. No menace, no grand destiny, no world to save. Just a beautiful thing making more beautiful things because that's its nature. For a region that spent so much time on death and war and loss through characters like AZ, Deontay is a soft little counterweight. A reminder that Kalos also just like making pretty things for the sake of it. The other two mythicals of the generation are a fair bit stranger, and one of them carries a mystery that the games never actually bothered to solve. So let's have a look at those two next, the troublemaker and the one that got left hanging. The other two mythicals of the generation are a proper odd couple. One is a mischievous little imp with far too much power, and the other is a creature carrying a mystery the games just quietly walked away from. Let's start with the troublemaker. Hooper is a small, grinning, genie-like creature, a psychic and ghost type, and its whole gimmick is rings. It conjures these golden hoops that act as portals through space, and it can send things, or pull things, across enormous distances through them. It's playful and a bit chaotic, the sort of Pokémon that causes problems mostly for the fun of it. And it's got a wonderful trick up its sleeve. Using a special item called the Prison Bottle, Hooper can be unleashed into a completely different form, Hooper Unbound, which is this huge, six-armed, genuinely intimidating version of the little imp. So it goes from a cheeky pocket-sized troublemaker to a towering, many-armed powerhouse, all its restrained energy suddenly let loose. The idea of a small contained mischief maker that's actually holding back an enormous amount of power is a fun one, and Hooper's got easily the most going on, lore-wise, of the three mythicals. Those ring portals ended up being genuinely important to the wider Pokémon world too. In other games, Hooper's ability to warp things across space was used to explain how a whole crowd of legendary Pokémon from completely different regions could suddenly turn up in one place. Its rings became the series' handy way of saying, "Don't worry about how this impossible creature got here, Hooper pulled it through a portal." So the little troublemaker quietly became one of the most useful pieces of connective machinery in the entire franchise. Not bad for an imp whose main hobby is causing bother. And then there's Volcanion, which is my favourite of the three, partly because of what it is and partly because of a loose end that still nags at me. Volcanion is a fire and water type, and here's the remarkable thing about that. It was the very first Pokémon ever to combine those two types. Fire and water, the two most classically opposed elements in the whole series. The very first pairing you ever choose between as a starter had never once been put together in a single creature until Volcanion came along. And it makes total sense when you see it. Volcanion is this heavy, mechanical-looking beast that generates enormous amounts of steam, water flashed into vapour by internal fire, powerful enough to blow away a mountain. Fire and water, not as opposites, but as the two halves of a steam engine. I think that's a brilliant idea, and it's a bit surprising it took the series that long to do it. But here's the mystery, the bit that genuinely bugs me in a fond way. Back in the Kalos region, there's a power plant, and it has a locked door. A door you can never open, no matter what you do. And for a long time, players poked at it and theorised about it, because it's exactly the sort of thing that usually leads somewhere in these games. And it was strongly implied that Volcanion, the steam creature, was connected to that locked door somehow. That behind it was the answer. But the games never actually followed through. The door stayed locked. Volcanion turned up as an event-only mythical handed out separately, with no real in-game explanation, tying it back to that door at all. So there's this dangling thread, a locked door, and a steam Pokémon that seemed meant to connect, that simply never got resolved. The story just left it hanging. I find that genuinely fascinating, in the way unfinished things always are. A door that goes nowhere, a creature that seems meant for it, and a connection the developers apparently intended and then never completed. It's the kind of loose end that keeps fans quietly speculating for years, exactly because the game refused to tie it off. And honestly, it fits a running theme with Kalos, this sense of a region full of ideas that didn't all quite get finished, of doors left locked and stories left dangling, which is something we're going to have to talk about properly before the night is done, because it's the bittersweet truth at the heart of this whole beautiful place. But before we get there, let's have a bit of fun with the region's genuine oddities, its glitches, its ghosts, and its strange little unexplained corners. Every big game launches with a few gremlins in it, and Kalos had one genuine whopper that's worth telling you about, because it's a proper piece of Pokémon history now. It's known as the Lumio City save glitch, and for a little while there, it was quietly terrifying to a lot of players. Here's what happened. In that big, beautiful city we spent so long admiring earlier, there were certain spots, specifically out on the wide outer boulevards, the circular roads ringing the city, where saving your game could go horribly wrong. You'd save, as you do, out on the street. Then later you'd switch your console off and come back to carry on. And there was a real chance the game simply wouldn't load properly. It would freeze. The area wouldn't come back. And the truly nasty part was that your save file, the one holding all your progress, could end up stuck and unusable. You couldn't move, you couldn't do anything, and everything you'd done was trapped behind a frozen screen. For a game people poured dozens of hours into, that's about as bad as a bug gets. Now, to be fair, it only happened in those specific outdoor spots on the boulevards. Saving inside buildings, in Pokémon centres and so on, was perfectly safe. So it wasn't that the whole city was cursed, just a few particular stretches of pavement. But of course, most players had no idea which bits were dangerous, so once word got out, there was this brief period where everyone was nervously avoiding saving anywhere in Lumios at all, just in case. Imagine that. The grand showpiece city of the region, the one they modelled so lovingly on Paris, and for a while people were tiptoeing through it, afraid to press save. There's something almost funny about it, in hindsight. The city of light, quietly booby-trapped. To their credit, the people behind the games moved fast. Nintendo acknowledged the problem pretty much straight away, and released a patch to fix it. And the patch didn't just stop the glitch from happening to new players. It could also repair the save files of people who'd already been caught out, pulling their trapped progress back into a usable state. So the story had a happy ending for most people. The city got uncursed, the frozen saves got rescued, and Lumios went back to being a place you could wander without fear. But for that little window, right at the start, it was a genuine white-knuckle experience for anyone who'd heard the rumours. What I find quietly charming about this, looking back, is how it's become a fond bit of folklore, rather than a black mark. Nobody really holds it against the games now. It's just one of those stories long-time players tell. The great Lumios save glitch, the time the prettiest city in the region would eat your progress if you saved in the wrong spot. It's part of the texture of the era, part of what made playing these games at launch feel like a shared adventure with a bit of real risk in it. There was a genuine sense of, be careful out there, mind where you save. You don't really get that anymore, with games patching themselves quietly in the background before you've even noticed anything was wrong. It also speaks to just how ambitious Lumios was, in a roundabout way. It was such a big, complex, sprawling city, far bigger and busier than anything Pokémon had really attempted, that the game occasionally buckled under the weight of its own ambition, trying to load it all back in. The glitch was, in a sense, the price of reaching for something grander than the hardware was entirely comfortable with, which is a very Kalos sort of flaw, honestly. It aimed high, it reached for beauty and scale, and every now and then it slightly overreached and tripped. I've got a lot of affection for that, The Lumiose glitch is the famous one, but it's far from the only strange thing lurking in these games. Kalos is stuffed with odd little secrets and unexplained corners, some of them genuinely eerie in a fun way. So let's go poking around a few of those before we start winding down for the night. Every Pokémon region has its little secrets tucked away in the corners, and Kalos has more than its share. Nothing frightening, we're winding down after all, but there are some genuinely odd and charming things hidden in these games, and poking at them is a lovely, low-stakes way to spend a sleepy half hour. The one people talk about most is the ghost girl of Lumiose City. Deep in that big city, in one of the office buildings, there's a lift you can ride, and players started reporting a strange little encounter with a mysterious girl who turns up, says something faintly cryptic, and then simply isn't there anymore. It became this quietly famous bit of the game, passed around and whispered about. The sort of gentle, spooky story that games this big always seem to grow. It's more eerie than scary, really. A brief, odd little moment in an otherwise ordinary skyscraper. I've always liked that a game so obsessed with beauty and light also had room for one small, unexplained shiver, hiding in a lift. There's a hidden message people found too, a stray bit of text lurking where you wouldn't expect it, something along the lines of someone going to fetch help and telling you to wait in the usual place. Out of context, tucked away like that, it's got this quietly unsettling quality, the kind of thing that sets your imagination running. Who's going for help, and where's the usual place, and who left this here? Nobody's ever fully sure. It's just there, a little orphaned line of dialogue, the kind of thing data miners and curious players love to unearth and argue over. Harmless, but it lingers in the mind a bit. Then there are the smaller, sillier curiosities which I find just as fun. The trash cans, for instance. Kalos is full of these tidy little bins dotted around, and if you go and check them, hopeful, they're always empty. Every single one. You can go round the whole region rummaging in bins like a raccoon and never once find so much as a spare Pokeball, which is a very funny, very pointless detail to notice. And once you've noticed it, you can't stop checking, just in case this is the one. It never is. The bins of Kalos guard their emptiness jealously. There's a lovely bit of postgame too, involving a detective and a street kid. After the main story, there's a whole little side adventure where you help out an eccentric international policeman with a case. And along the way, you meet a young girl called Emma, living rough in the back streets of Lumiose with her Pokémon. It's a surprisingly warm, human little story tucked away in the corner of the game, all about looking out for someone who's fallen through the cracks of that glittering city, and there's a practical bonus to it as well. Once it's all wrapped up, Emma becomes reliably one of the best sources of money in the whole game, someone you can go back to and battle for a generous payout. So the girl you helped out of the gutter ends up quietly funding the rest of your adventure, which is a rather sweet way for a kindness to pay you back. For the truly dedicated, there were rewards buried behind completing that enormous Pokédex too. Fill in enough of it, catch enough of the region's creatures, and you'd be handed special little charms. There's one that quietly improves your luck when breeding Pokémon, and another, the really coveted one, that improves your odds of finding those rare, differently coloured, shiny Pokémon that collectors obsess over. They're not flashy items, they don't do anything you can see, but for the sort of player who wanted to catch absolutely everything and then hunt down the rarest colour variants on top, those charms were the quiet prize at the end of a very long road. A small thank you from the game for caring that much. That's the thing about Kalos, really. It rewards poking around. It rewards the curious player who checks the bins and rides the odd lift and helps the street kid and fills in the Pokédex. There's always a little more hidden just off the main path, a secret or a story or a charm waiting for anyone patient enough to look. For a region built around beauty, it turns out a lot of that beauty is in the details you'd only find if you slowed right down and wandered. And wandering slowly is rather the spirit of the whole place. So let's do exactly that for a bit and look at the quiet, everyday texture of just living in Kalos, away from all the big plot and legendary drama. Away from all the legendary drama and the ancient weapons, Kalos had a whole layer of gentle, everyday features that made it a genuinely pleasant place just to potter about in. And since we're in wind down mode now, this is exactly the sort of thing to sink into. The small comforts of the region. Take the Battle Chateau. This was a grand country mansion, out in the countryside, where trainers would gather to battle in a very civilized, very fancy sort of way. And it had this lovely bit of roleplay built into it. You'd start off at the bottom of the social ladder, a mere baron or baroness, and by battling and winning you'd climb up through a whole system of noble titles, Viscount, Earl, Marquess, all the way up towards Duke or Duchess, and eventually Grand Duke. So it turned battling into this genteel game of social climbing, working your way up the aristocracy of a fictional French manor house, one duel at a time. It's such a charmingly silly, very Kalos idea. Even the fighting had to come with a noble title and a nice building to do it in. I loved swanning back in as a freshly promoted Marquess, honestly. Pure nonsense and delightful. Then there was the Friend Safari, which was this quiet, sociable little corner of the game. It was a special area where the Pokémon you could find depended entirely on the friends you'd connected with. Each friend you added unlocked a patch of the safari with its own set of creatures, sometimes including ones you couldn't easily get anywhere else, and even a decent chance at those rare shiny variants. So the more people you knew, the richer your hunting grounds became. It was a gentle way of tying the game to your actual friendships. This idea that other people quietly expanded your world and brought new creatures into it. Very on theme for a generation, so wrapped up in bonds and connection. Your friends literally made the region bigger. There were O-powers too, these little temporary boosts you could grant yourself, or nicely, send to other players. You could give someone a quick burst of extra experience, or better luck catching Pokémon, or cheaper prices in shops, as a small favour across the network. So there was this constant, low-key exchange of little kindnesses happening between players, people quietly buffing each other's adventures from afar. It's a small thing, but it added to that warm, connected feeling the whole generation was going for. Strangers doing each other small good turns through the ether. All of this sat on top of a genuinely impressive online layer, which for its time felt quite magical. You had this constant sense of other players drifting around the edges of your game, available to trade or battle, or help at more or less any moment, without any of the fiddly setup that earlier games had demanded. The world felt populated, connected, alive with other people, all off on their own journeys through the same France-shaped map. For a lot of players, myself included, that feeling of being quietly part of a huge, gentle, global community of trainers was one of the nicest things about the whole experience. You never felt entirely alone out there. And there's something rather fitting about all these features, sharing one common thread: the noble ranks you climbed by battling others, the safari that grew with your friendships, the little O-power favours flying back and forth, the whole seamless online world. Every one of them, in its own way, was about connecting you to other people. Kalos took its big abstract theme, that bonds and connection are what really matter, and then quietly wove it into the most mundane, everyday corners of the game. Even the small comforts were about not being alone. It's a very warm design philosophy when you sit with it. A lot of games treat their online features as a competitive arena, all rankings and beating strangers. Kalos leaned the other way, towards this softer idea of a shared world where other people mostly made your own adventure gentler and richer. You climbed a silly aristocracy, you borrowed creatures from your friends, you swapped small kindnesses with strangers. Nobody had to lose for you to gain. There's one feature in particular that captured that spirit better than any other, though. This genuinely lovely bit of blind global generosity that I want to give its own little moment. So let's talk about the joy of sending a Pokémon out into the world with no idea what you'll get back. The feature I wanted to give its own moment is called Wonder Trade, and it might be my favourite thing in the whole generation, purely for how lovely and daft it is. Here's how it works. You pick a Pokémon from your collection, anyone you like, and you offer it up to the world. And in return, you get a completely random Pokémon back, from a completely random player, somewhere out there on the planet. That's it. You have no idea what you're going to get, and no idea who you're trading with. It's a blind swap with a stranger, and the joy of it is entirely in the not knowing. You send off some spare little common creature, and you wait, and then something appears in its place, and it could be absolutely anything. Another common one, sure, most of the time. But sometimes something rare, something from a far-off region you'd never seen, something with a nickname the previous owner lovingly gave it, or occasionally a genuine treasure that some generous soul just decided to fling out into the void for whoever caught it. It turned trading into a lucky dip, a little hit of pure surprise every time. I lost hours to it, just breeding up a box of spare creatures and sending them out one by one to see what the world would send back. There's something quietly wonderful about that. This vast, invisible net of players, all lobbing Pokémon at each other blindly. And every so often, one of them lands in your hands like a little gift from nowhere. And there was a real generosity that grew up around it. People would deliberately breed lovely, useful, or rare Pokémon specifically to give away through Wonder Trade, purely to make some random stranger's day. You'd sometimes receive something clearly special, something someone had put real effort into, sent out for free to whoever happened to catch it. No thanks expected, no way to even know who to thank. Just a kindness cast into the dark. For a generation so preoccupied with bonds and connection, Wonder Trade was maybe the purest expression of it. Connection with a total stranger, built entirely on the pleasant surprise of not knowing what you'd get. I've always thought that said something rather nice about people, that so many of them chose to be generous with it. Now, on a gentler and more bittersweet note, there's a place in Kalos I want to tell you about, tucked away at the very edge of the map. It's called Pokémon Village, and it's this quiet, hidden little settlement deep in the woods, and it has one of the more poignant premises in the games. It's where abandoned Pokémon go, creatures that were released by their trainers, or mistreated, or simply left behind, find their way here to this secluded spot far from people, and they live together, wary and cautious, keeping their distance from any human who wanders in. It's a genuinely melancholy idea, and the game handles it with a light touch, which makes it land all the harder. When you first arrive, the Pokémon there are nervous of you, understandably, given their history with people. They've learned not to trust, and there's this quiet sadness to the whole place, a hidden village full of the forgotten and the discarded, living out of sight at the end of the world. For a region that spends so much of its time on beauty and glamour and fashion, Pokémon Village is a soft, sad reminder of the ones who didn't get to be anyone's beloved partner, the ones who got left behind. I always found it a genuinely affecting little corner. Kalos, for all its shine, didn't pretend that everything was lovely for everyone. There's a small mechanical thing worth mentioning too, about how the region organised its creatures. The Kalos Pokédex was actually split into 3 separate parts, based on which chunk of the region you were exploring. There was a central section, a coastal section, and a mountain section, each with its own list of creatures to find in that part of the map. It was a neat way of breaking up what was a huge roster into more manageable, more thematic pieces, so your collecting felt tied to where you actually were. The creatures of the central heartland, the creatures of the coast, the creatures of the mountains, each their own little book to fill in. A small thing, but it gave a nice sense of the region, having distinct regions within it. Distinct flavours, in different corners. All of these features, taken together, are why Kalos was such a comfortable place to simply exist in. And that comfort, that sense of a lovely place to spend time, makes what happened to Kalos afterwards feel all the more bittersweet. Because for a very long time, the region got left behind almost as thoroughly as the Pokémon in that hidden village. So let's talk gently about that. Here's the bittersweet truth. At the heart of Kalos, the thing I've been circling all night, for all its beauty, all its ambition, all those lovely ideas, these games left an awful lot on the table. And for years afterward, Kalos became known, a little sadly, as the region of unfinished business. The most common complaint was the post-game. Once you'd beaten the Pokémon League and rolled the credits, there just wasn't a great deal left to do compared to other Pokémon games. The main story was gorgeous, the world was a delight to wander, but then it sort of stopped, and you were left with this feeling of, is that it? For a region this big and this rich, that thinness at the end stung. It felt like a wonderful book missing its last few chapters. And then there was the third version that never came. This is the big one. For a lot of us, Pokémon games from this era followed a pattern. You'd get the pair, in this case X and Y, and then, a little while later, an expanded third version that filled in the gaps, deepened the story, and used the bits that got left out. And everything about Kalos was practically begging for one. Remember Zygarde, that green serpent of order, the Z of the trio, clearly built to be the star of a game, and then left sitting in a cave doing nothing. Remember that locked door in the power plant that never opened? Remember all those loose threads? Everyone assumed a game called Pokémon Z was coming to tie it all together. It was the obvious move. The Z was right there, waiting. It never came. For reasons of timing and priorities, the third Kalos game simply never happened. The series moved on to other regions, and Kalos was left as this beautiful half-finished thing, its greatest mysteries dangling, its third legendary still waiting in the dark for a spotlight that never arrived, and the fans felt it. Kalos developed this reputation as the region with so much wasted potential, the one that was clearly meant to be more than it got to be. A gorgeous sketch that never became the full painting. There's a real melancholy to that, and honestly, it fits a region so preoccupied with loss and things left unfinished. Even its place in the series became a story about something incomplete. Years went by. Other regions came and went. Mega Evolution, that beloved headline feature, quietly disappeared from the games and stayed gone for a long, long time, much to everyone's sorrow. And Kalos just sat there in people's memories. This lovely place they'd visited once and never quite got to finish exploring. If you'd asked most fans, they'd have told you Kalos was probably done. A one-generation wonder, admired but abandoned. And then at last, it came back. Well over a decade after those first games, the series announced it was returning to Kalos, specifically to Lumiose City, that Paris we spent so long admiring. The game is called Pokémon Legends, Zygarde, and it finally arrived in late 2025, and it is, in almost every way, the loving second chance that Kalos always deserved. It's set entirely within Lumiose, years after the original adventure, with the whole city in the middle of a great redevelopment, being reshaped into somewhere humans and Pokémon can properly share, and it brought back the things people had been missing for years. Mega Evolution returned, front and centre, its lore finally expanded the way fans had always wanted. After being gone from the games for the best part of a decade, Zygarde, that poor neglected serpent, was finally given its proper due. Right there in the title, its complete form central to the whole story at last. The Zad it was always meant to be. And Azed, our sad ancient king, is still there in Lumiose, still that same impossibly tall, impossibly old figure, still watched over by his one beloved Floette, with her little black flower. The game reaches all the way back to the oldest, saddest story in the region, and picks that thread back up with real care. Even the ultimate weapon, that terrible thing AZ built and buried, echoes through the new story's troubles. I find something genuinely moving about all of it. A region that spent over a decade known as the Great Unfinished Chapter, the place of wasted potential and locked doors and legendaries left waiting, finally got someone to come back and finish the thought. To open the doors, to give Zygarde its moment, to bring Mega Evolution home, to sit with old AZ one more time. It's a bit like the region's own themes coming true. Kalos was always about loss and renewal, about things ending and coming back, about a flower returning after an impossibly long absence. And then Kalos itself got exactly that. It was let go and mourned a little, and then, after all those years, it came back. There's a lesson buried in there somewhere, if you want one, about patience, and about how the things we love aren't always gone for good, just because they go quiet for a while. But I won't push it. Mostly I just find it lovely. The prettiest, most unfinished region in Pokémon finally got its ending, long after anyone thought it would. And it turns out the beautiful place was worth waiting for all along. Which I think brings us round nicely to where we should be at this hour of the night. So let me tell you why, out of all these regions, this is the one that stuck with me. I've talked about a lot of facts tonight. The France of it all, the deer and the bird, the sad old king, the poodle you can style, the butterfly that knows where you live. But if you'll indulge me for a few quiet minutes before we wind down properly, I want to say a bit about why Kalos specifically is the region I keep coming back to. Because it's not the biggest and it's not the most complete, and it's certainly not the one with the most Pokémon in it. And yet it's the one that lodged itself somewhere in me and stayed. Part of it is just how unashamed it is about wanting to be beautiful. Most things are a bit embarrassed to admit they're reaching for beauty. They hedge, they qualify, they pretend they're going for something more serious. Kalos didn't. It looked you dead in the eye and said, I am going to be lovely, and everything in me is going to be about loveliness. And then it went and built a whole France to prove it. There's something disarming about that kind of sincerity. It's not cool exactly, it's earnest. And I've come to think earnestness wears a lot better over the years than cool ever does. Part of it is the sense of place. So many games are set in worlds that are clearly just backdrops, painted flats for you to walk past. Kalos feels like somewhere. You can ride a goat through a city based on Paris. You can groom a poodle and watch its haircut grow out. You can help a girl living rough in the back streets. You can rummage through empty bins and ride a lift and meet a ghost. It's textured. It's got corners and quirks and small human stories tucked into it. It feels less like a level and more like a place you once spent a summer and half remember fondly, and could still find your way around if you closed your eyes. And part of it, honestly, is the sadness underneath all the beauty. I've grown to really value that Kalos didn't only want to be pretty, it wanted its beauty to mean something, and it understood, in its quiet way, that real beauty has loss folded into it. That's why it has a bird of death sitting right next to its deer of life. That's why its most memorable character is a grieving man who did a terrible thing for love and spent an eternity paying for it. That's why it has a hidden village full of the abandoned and a locked door that never opens, and a whole story about waiting a very long time for something to come back. Kalos knew that a thing is often most beautiful precisely because it doesn't last, and it built that idea into everything, gently, without ever making a big speech about it. The other thing I love, and I've come back to this a few times tonight, is how much these games believed in fondness as a kind of power. Not strength, not cleverness, not force, fondness. The whole generation kept insisting, in mechanic after mechanic, that the bonds between you and your creatures were the thing that actually mattered. Your Pokémon fought harder because you'd been kind to it. It changed shape because it loved you. The ancient man found peace because he watched an ordinary trainer care for their team. In a series that's often, let's be honest, about making small creatures beat each other up, Kalos quietly built its whole heart around tenderness. And I find that genuinely lovely. It's a gentle idea, and we could all do with a few more gentle ideas. I think in the end, that's why it's the one I reach for on a night like this. It's a place that's kind and a bit melancholy and unashamedly pretty and full of small human textures and built on the belief that being fond of things is a strength rather than a weakness. That's a nice sort of place to spend a few sleepy hours in. It asks nothing of you. It just wants to show you somewhere beautiful and tell you a sad story or two and let you ride a goat past a fake Eiffel Tower and remind you quietly that the things we love are worth loving even though nothing lasts, which is about as much wisdom as I've got in me at this hour. So let's let it all settle and bring the night gently into land. So there it is, Kalos, the region that decided above all else that it was going to be beautiful, and then spent years quietly proving it could be sad and clever and kind as well. We covered a lot of ground tonight in that gentle, wandering way. We started at the western edge of a France-shaped map and worked our way inward, through a city that's secretly Paris, past castles and standing stones, and a seaside town or two. We met a knight, a mage and a ninja, all small enough to fit in your pocket. We watched a deer of life stand across from a bird of death, colour-coded like the inside of a television. We sat for a while with an old king and his flower, which is still, I think, the saddest and loveliest story these games ever told. We styled a poodle. We held a console upside down for a squid. We petted our Pokémon until they loved us enough to fight a little harder, and we followed the region all the way from its unfinished beginnings to the long-awaited day it finally came home. I hope somewhere in all of that you drifted off. That was rather the point. If you're still with me, that's lovely too, and if you're not, well, none of this will be going anywhere. It'll all still be here, the deer and the bird and the sad old king and the empty bins, waiting patiently for the next time you fancy a wander. If there's one thing to carry off into sleep with you, let it be that gentle idea Kalos kept coming back to, that the things we grow fond of are worth being fond of, even the small ones, even the ones that don't last. A flower in a box, a butterfly wearing the colours of home, a city that goes dark and then, eventually, lights back up. Beauty, in the end, was never really about being flawless. It was about caring for something and letting it change and loving it anyway. For a game about pocket monsters, that's a surprisingly good thing to fall asleep thinking about. And if your mind wants something soft to hold on to as it drifts, you could do worse than just picturing the place. The lamplit boulevards curving away from that tall-lit tower, the little cafes with their windows glowing warm, the canal cutting quietly through the middle of it all, catching the light. Somewhere out past the edges of the city, a snowy town where it never quite stops falling, and a seaside town where the tide comes in and out, patient as anything. A field of old stones standing in the dark the way they have, for longer than anyone can properly imagine. A goat trotting home down an empty street. A butterfly folding its wings somewhere, patterned like whatever corner of the world it happens to belong to. None of it in any hurry. That's the thing I keep coming back to about Kalos, right at the end here. Nothing in it ever seems to be rushing. The whole region moves at the pace of someone strolling through a place they love, in no particular hurry to be anywhere, happy just to look, which is a rare quality in anything these days, let alone a video game. It gives you permission to slow down, to stop chasing the next thing, to just be somewhere pretty for a while, and let that be enough. And tonight, at least, that's exactly what it's been. Enough. There's plenty more of Kalos we didn't get to tonight, mind. Whole routes we skated straight past. Little Pokémon we never stopped to meet. Corners of Lumiose we left in the dark. There's always more, in a place built with this much care. But that's all right. We don't have to see all of it at once. There'll be other nights, and other quiet hours, and the region will still be there. Still pretty, still patient, whenever we feel like going back. For now, though, let the map go soft at the edges. Let the lights of the city dim, one boulevard at a time. Let the deer settle down among the branches, and the old king rest easy with his flower finally back in his hands, and the whole beautiful, unfinished, well-loved region drift quietly out of focus. Thanks for wandering through it with me. Sleep well. And if you'd like to do this again some evening, somewhere new, you know where to find me.